Past Santa Claus in his sleigh and a double row of candy canes, deputy coroners brought the body of 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey from her upscale home. Neighbors described the young girl as beautiful and polite. In 1995, she won the Little Miss Colorado pageant. Boulder police won't comment on her cause of death, only saying that she wasn't shot or stabbed. They are investigating her death as a homicide. So far, no arrests have been made.
This case started as a kidnapping. Police were called here to the scene at about 6 a.m. the morning after Christmas. Someone inside this house had made a 911 call saying that little JonBenet had been kidnapped. Well, when police got here, they went inside the house, and a short time later, they found the little girl's body. The parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, were home at the time, but detectives say the parents are not suspects. The father is the president of Access Graphics, located on Boulder's Pearl Street Mall. The couple does have another child, a son around 10 years old. Whether the boy is a suspect, investigators won't comment, saying only that right now, this murder investigation is wide open.
In the case of the child beauty queen found murdered in her Colorado home, Boulder police detectives have now returned from interviewing about 30 people in Georgia, where JonBenet Ramsey has relatives and where she was buried. A spokeswoman says the police have also been in contact with the girl's mother and father and hope to interview them later this week. Diana Olick has our report.
Investigators who have been focusing on the family home of 6-year-old murder victim JonBenet Ramsey have now issued 2 search warrants in Boulder and in Michigan, where the family owns another home. What they gathered is still unknown. Meanwhile, people who didn't even know JonBenet are stopping by the house to lay tributes.
It's just really touches your heart. We've got 3 little girls and just couldn't imagine life without them.
In the week since the murder, we have learned more about the world in which JonBenet lived. A beautiful child of a wealthy family, driven to succeed in a unique world of life and pageantry.
I wanna be a cowboy sweetheart.
JonBenet was polished and precocious, part of a world involving children paraded before their friends and parents. She was named Little Miss Colorado.
Did JonBenet have a bright future?
Oh, definitely.
Talent agent Deanna Hediger met her 2 years ago when JonBenet's mother, a former Miss West Virginia herself, was starting her on the pageant circuit, an expensive and competitive goal.
She seemed quite involved in her daughter doing well.
Was it really important to her?
It seemed like, that she was really into it and really wanted her daughter to do well. Yeah.
The Ramsey family showcased their daughter in everything they did. This tape was commissioned by the Ramseys 2 years ago as a Christmas gift to friends.
Hello, I'm Patsy Ramsey. Daddy's not here, but this is JonBenet. She's 4, Burke is 7. And we'd like to welcome you to our home and wish you a very Merry Christmas. Wait, JonBenet.
The privileged world in which JonBenet lived now extends even to her death. Her parents have hired their own private detective to investigate the murder in this home. Boulder police are finished here, and some detectives have gone to Michigan. They still have not interviewed the parents.
Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, let's revisit what Governor Bill Owens said on national television this morning. He said that you were hiding behind your public relations people, your attorneys, and now you were hiding behind easy journalism.
As a woman, I am appalled that he said that. I consider Barbara Walters and Katie Couric to be one of the 2 most professional, experienced journalists in our country today.
They demanded and got from us the right to ask us any question on camera that they chose to ask.
We're not hiding behind anyone.
And let me say one more time, we said this the last time the governor accused us of hiding behind our attorneys and PR firm. We have no PR firm. There were no attorneys present at the Barbara Walters interview or the Katie Couric interview. There are no attorneys present here today.
The JonBenet Ramsey case is a decades-long unsolved crime that has shocked and mesmerized the nation for the amount of absurd twists and turns, the many complex layers, and the questionable behavior of the parents every step of the way. I'd be shocked to hear of anyone who's not at least semi-familiar with this case, especially with the new documentaries and the yearly updates serving as that constant reminder. I will give a brief summary, because this case is so fully loaded with mystery, and there's a lot of distractions and red herrings, with new developments continuing to surface over the course of nearly 3 decades. We're going to be exploring the less widely known details that I believe need to be revisited. This is one that's haunted me for most of my life. I'm only a year older than JonBenet, and although most of the memories of my childhood are still pretty vague, I vividly remember seeing her face all over television, news, and magazine stands, understanding that she was no longer with us, and that it was a horrific tragedy. But it wouldn't be until years later that I truly understood the depth and details gripping the psyche of the masses.
When the beauty pageant pictures came out and they put JonBenet on the cover of the magazine, they sold an extra 500,000 copies a week. They said, we want a story a week, every week. We don't care what the story is. We just want to put JonBenet's picture on the cover.
Nothing about this case really makes any sense, until we consider the other potential factors that the Ramseys spent a great deal of money trying to keep under wraps and deny altogether, which was and is still pretty strange if they weren't involved in any way and wanted to get to the bottom of what happened.
If you've been following this story, you may have gathered that nobody knows very much at all. Police may have a suspect in mind, but if they do, they aren't sharing that information. And there are very few sources who are talking, which only fuels the speculation. Who could have done it? Who could have entered the house without breaking in? Who killed JonBenet Ramsey?
While the police cannot force someone to talk, there are several key people investigators would like to question. Tops on the list, John and Patsy Ramsey, as well as their son Bert. All 3 talked with detectives early in the investigation, but recently they refused to take any more questions. Questions the police want answered.
In this video, we're going to be analyzing the most compelling aspects of the case, and in the way conspiracy analysts were made out to be some kind of demented for even suggesting these other possibilities. Until basically this year of the Great Awakening. Between the Menendez brothers and the Diddy case, there's a lot of new information about the degrees of evil that can come with wealth, influence, and/or fame. So we must go back and review all of these kinds of cases with a more modern and trauma-informed lens to better understand where we are now and how we got here. Why so many children are literally disappearing into thin air, in spite of the mass surveillance we now live under. There are a handful of similar cases that I believe all have one common denominator of truth that maybe the masses are just not ready to consider or accept. It's time to have our ears and eyes wide open. No more of this hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil nonsense that was impressed upon us as a literal mantra of the 90s. And maybe that's part of what's kept us in such an ignorant trance. JonBenet was a 6-year-old beauty pageant sensation, taking the circuit by storm. Her mother Patricia Ramsey, also known as Patsy, being a former beauty queen herself, led her daughter to winning several titles including Little Miss Colorado, America's Royale Miss, and National Tiny Miss Beauty.
So you yourself had entered beauty contests?
Yes.
I'm a junior at West Virginia University.
So this was, what, fun for you both to have her do this?
It was the most wonderful time of my life.
Her father, John Ramsey, a former naval officer, led a successful tech company called Access Graphics that boasted over $1 billion worth of sales in 1996 alone. Which, if we're talking now, that's Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos kind of wealth and success. And yet, no one really knows exactly what kind of computerized services and products this company performed or offered. They were a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin, a military defense outfit. So by national security standards, it was likely intended for their business dealings to be somewhat secretive. Either way, it was quite obvious to those in his sphere that John was doing quite well for himself, being awarded a $118,000 Christmas bonus, owning a sprawling 3-level home in Boulder, Colorado, and a stunning vacation home at a resort town in Michigan. John also had his own private jet. On Christmas night of 1996, tragedy struck, and would shatter the picture-perfect family image, and their quintessential American dream became a horrific nightmare. Patsy awoke on Boxing Day, December 26, 1996, to find a 3-page ransom letter placed at the bottom of the spiral staircase. This letter was written in the home, using one of the Ramseys' own pens and stationery.
Patsy cannot be 100% excluded, but they can't prove it's her handwriting. And that, of course, makes the police even more suspicious.
My theory is quite simple. Whoever authored the ransom note killed the child.
Your contention is she wrote the note.
I do.
You must have conjured something in your head for you to come out and call me a murderer of my child.
Children of this age, when they die, tend to die at the hands of their parents. So the focus is naturally going to be on the parents to begin with. Now, in the house, the ransom note is written on a pad that belongs to Patsy. So this is the notepad. This location right here is where the note was physically found by Patsy. The pen that was used was in the house.
Right off the bat, this outrageously long and drawn-out letter was noted as abnormally lengthy and strange in context, especially if it had been written in the home, as the literal crime was taking place. Generally, there's some element of urgency, and ransom notes get right to the point, even if prepared in advance. This alleged kidnapper was demanding the exact same amount that John had received as a bonus, $118,000, and was signed Victory, SBTC, which some believe was a reference to the Subic Bay Training Center, where John was stationed while in the Navy, and suggested that if not John Ramsey himself, it was someone that knew him well. The letter also eerily matched Patsy's left-handed writing, as per the conclusion of a handful of different handwriting experts, including those employed by their own private investigation team. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Shortly after no call came in from the supposed kidnapper, which investigators had spent most of the day preparing for and anticipating, and the Ramseys, their gathered friends, and their local pastor did not acknowledge the time had passed.
8:10 a.m., Arndt arrived at the Ramsey home and meets John Ramsey for the first time.
How did he strike you?
Cordial.
Cordial?
Mm-hmm.
Upset?
Cordial.
Distraught?
Cordial.
10 a.m., the deadline imposed by the writer of the ransom note for a telephone call.
10 o'clock comes and goes, and there's no acknowledgement within the house from anyone that the deadline imposed by the author of the ransom note has come and gone.
Nobody said it's 10 o'clock and the kidnappers haven't called?
Nobody said that.
Was that something else you took note of?
Absolutely.
By 10:30 in the morning, Arndt was the only police officer in the house with John and Patsy Ramsey, their pastor, and 4 family friends. As they waited for news, the tension was mounting. Arndt called her station house for backup repeatedly, but none had arrived.
How many times did you call the police department asking where your backup was and what was going on?
Well, I remember at least 2 calls. Both times I was told everybody's in a meeting. They got your message, and that was it.
Were you feeling pressure being in charge of a group this large and with anxiety that high?
I felt tremendous pressure.
I should also mention that their closest friends, Fleet White Jr. and his wife Priscilla, had shown up to the Ramsey residence that morning very shortly after police, as if they were already dressed and ready, ahead of the Ramseys' call to them. Patsy was also still wearing the outfit she had worn to the Whites' home the night prior for Christmas dinner, which suggested that she never went to sleep, or was put to sleep, before she had a chance to change into bedclothes. John Ramsey and Fleet White Jr. were advised to once again search the house from top to bottom. Knowing the layout better than investigators, the pair headed straight to the basement, and although it had already been searched by investigators and Fleet Jr., the lifeless body of JonBenet was found in the wine cellar.
1:01 p.m. Although the house had already been searched by patrolmen before she arrived, Arndt says that in order to break the building tension, she asked John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White to search the house again, top to bottom, looking for anything out of place. She says she gave them specific instructions not to touch anything. She says John Ramsey headed straight to the basement. She heard Fleet White scream for an ambulance, and then a chilling discovery. For Arndt, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place.
And I see John Ramsey carrying JonBenet up the last 3 steps from the basement. And my mind exploded. And everything that I had noted that morning that stuck out instantly made sense. And JonBenet was clearly dead. Then she's been dead for a while. I ordered him to put JonBenet down. I knelt next to her and I leaned down to her face. And John leaned down opposite. me, and his face was just inches from mine. And we had a nonverbal exchange that I will never forget. And he asked if she was dead. And I said, yes, she's dead. And I told him to go back to the room and to dial 911. And as we looked at each other, I remember, and I wore a shoulder holster, tucking my gun right next to me and consciously counting, I've got 18 bullets.
Why did you do that?
Because I didn't know if we'd all be alive when people showed up. I'd said everything made sense in that instance. And I knew what happened.
Do you think your fear was well-founded?
You bet I do. There's no doubt in my mind.
To this day?
Never wavered.
You were afraid because you thought the killer was still in the house.
I knew it.
Absolutely?
Absolutely.
Linda, I mean, you talk about the bias we were faced with. Linda Arnott, the first detective that was there all morning, said on national television, I saw it in John Ramsey's eyes that morning that he was the killer. Conclusion.
That early.
What'd she see in your eyes?
I don't know. I think she saw shock. I think she saw the eyes of a father who had just been told his daughter was dead and she was lying in front of him. I don't know what I looked like. I'm sure I looked horrible.
Between the lack of experience of the detectives and investigators, when it came to homicide cases, and having treated it as a kidnapping to that point, the entire crime scene was effectively tainted. John tore the duct tape from JonBenet's mouth and carried her upstairs, held at arm's length away from him, and holding her up by the waist, which investigators noted as strange, on top of having compromised the scene.
But the police officer, the police detective told you to search the house. Tell us about that, please.
I don't remember exactly when it was that morning, but we were standing in the foyer of the house, and Linda Arnott asked me to take someone with me and go through the house thoroughly, look for anything that was out of the ordinary. Fleet was standing there, my friend, and we both went to the basement. First went into what we call the train room, which is where we found the open window and the suitcase up against the wall. We looked there for glass, again, to see if we could find any glass, because the window was not only open, it was broken. Then I went to the room where we did find JonBenet. The door was latched. I unlatched and pulled it open, and instantly what I'd found.
You knew there was a broken window downstairs, right?
Well, I had broken that glass and then opened the window to get in previous summer because I'd left my key and Patsy was gone. I thought we had it fixed, but we never went in the basement, so I didn't know that. So I wasn't surprised that the glass was broken, but I was surprised that the window was open.
So you come to this door and it's closed. And what's in that door?
Well, we called it the wine cellar, but there's never any wine in it. It was a junk room. I was just going through methodically every square inch of that basement, and I opened the door, and there's JonBenet.
Take me through the moment that your eyes fell on JonBenet's face as she was lying there on the floor. Did you know she was dead?
No, not at that point. I mean, I had this rush of, thank God I found her. And it was just this overwhelming sense of joy that I'd found my child. And her hands were tied over her head. She had tape on her mouth. I immediately took the tape off. Her eyes were closed.
Could you, at that point, perceive her injuries at the time? Could you see her neck and her head?
No, I didn't. There was a red spot on her throat. I didn't see the garrote because it was too deeply embedded in her skin. And I just was hoping she'd wake up and began to realize that she wasn't gonna, and just started to scream. I picked her up, carried her upstairs. I don't know what I was thinking, but I was just horrified. I couldn't speak. I was just screaming, and I took her upstairs and laid her down. I guess I was taking her to help in my mind. I didn't perhaps want to accept that she was dead. Linda Arndt felt down beside her as I was and felt for her pulse and looked me in the eye and said, "She's dead." And that's when I was just stunned. She looked very peaceful.
She looked like she was sleeping. She had some marks on her face and on her neck.
That she thought that John Ramsey killed his daughter and that they might kill her. It was shocking to me that she would think that.
How is it that you have all these cops searching a home and nobody finds the body, but you asked John Ramsey to go look for things out of the ordinary, and he finds his daughter in a room that had never been opened by anybody in law enforcement? That's crazy.
JonBenet had blunt force trauma to the head and a makeshift garrote around her neck, with the same white cord used to bind her hands together. She also had what was determined to be stun gun marks on her neck.
So 2 hours later, a detective comes.
Linda Arndt.
Okay. And was she helpful?
Yeah, I mean, she was trying to sort things out. And I remember she sat me down and said, you know, when you talk to this person they call, you got to insist you hear JonBenet's voice. So I was, you know, as ready as I could be for that call. And of course, 10 o'clock came and went.
So at the time, you felt like she was being helpful. You had no idea that she considered you.
Oh, no.
To be the culprit.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Linda Arndt, the lead detective that was there, went on national television a few months ago and said, I didn't act right. I was too calm, cordial.
Did it surprise you to hear that that was her reaction?
I don't remember being cordial. She was there to help me. I was grateful for her being there. So she interpreted that as being cordial. So be it. She had never been in a situation like that as a police officer, I learned later. In retrospect, we called the police. We thought they knew what they were doing, and they didn't have a clue.
Who suggested for you to search the house?
Linda Arndt. She said, take Fleet White with you and search the house, see if you notice anything out of the ordinary.
He should not have been allowed to search that house by himself. He could have tampered with evidence without even knowing that it was evidence. That's a critical mistake.
So where did you begin?
Went down to the basement.
Why start there?
It's the most logical entry point. Went into we called it the train room. The kids had a train set up in this. There was a window open. There was a suitcase sitting under the window, which shouldn't have been there. And I noted that and mentioned it to Fleet. I said, that shouldn't be there.
What Linda Arndt said is that your eyes met and she knew in that moment you killed your daughter.
Linda Arndt has stated publicly that when she saw John with JonBenet, it was like 1,000 lights going off in her mind. She knew exactly who had killed JonBenet.
The detective who first handled the case has no questions about who is guilty.
I know who killed JonBenet. There's no doubt in my mind who killed JonBenet. And while this investigation is still ongoing, I don't think it's appropriate that I say that name out loud.
Linda Arndt was the first detective on the scene at the Ramsey house on December 26, 1996, the morning John and Patsy Ramsey had reported their 6-year-old daughter JonBenet missing.
At one point, she said she was so worried that she was in the presence of a bad person that she was counting the bullets that she had on her body, and that she had 18 bullets because she feared she might have to shoot her way out of there.
Frightening and incompetent, beyond incompetent. Shouldn't have been a police officer.
There's a detective, Linda Arndt, who deals with various emotional cases, not a homicide detective, not a kidnapping detective, because the Boulder Police Department didn't have those experts.
Is your interpretation that she thought she's going to have to shoot everybody? That
yeah.
All in on
I think her comment was, I looked around and counted the people and then counted the bullets in my gun. I mean, this is crazy stuff. absolutely crazy stuff.
From the beginning, suspicion fell on her parents. It shadows them to this day. Could John and Patsy Ramsey have killed their own child in such a horrific way? Why did the police suspect them? And if they didn't commit the crime, who did?
The medical examiner who performed the autopsy noted signs of long-term SA.
This was not a murder. This was, well, technically it would be manslaughter, whatever, but it wasn't designed to be a murder. It was an accidental death that occurred during sexual play by the father. There was no intruder. No intruder. When you see me next and I have hair down to my waistline, like some of the NFL football players do, that's when the intruder will be found. This is a game. Patsy Ramsey, the mother, was out of the sex business, stage 4 ovarian cancer. She followed surgery, radiation, chemotherapy. The little girl was the surrogate. And the father, digital penetration. It's all there in the autopsy. Chronic inflammation, focal erosion, the vaginal vault, the 7 o'clock position, birefringent material, the most common source of which in any household is talcum powder. Put it all together. And then you have this cockamamie note. We represent a small foreign faction.
It was the weirdest note of all time.
$118,000. You like that number? Is exactly the bonus that John Ramsey received the year before.
Yeah, for Christmas.
Not 100, not 200, $118,000. And by the way, he forgot to bring pen and paper. But no problem. In the middle of the night, he finds pen and paper. He starts to write it. He writes. He doesn't like the beginning. He crumbles the paper, throws it down, and then starts to write again. You like that? And then he leaves the house. And by the way, he knew about the room in the basement. The homicide detectives getting there at 6 o'clock in the morning never even knew that room existed.
Yeah.
Looking for the 6-year-old girl, never even knew that room was there. A maid who worked there for 6 months never knew about that room. But this outside intruder who was able to get in without awakening anybody, he knew about that room where he took the little girl and he had his way and then he left.
In your book, you say you've never read the autopsy.
No.
That's just not something you want to know.
I don't want to go there. No.
Did you ever imagine that 15 years later it would still be unsolved?
No. I had confidence that it would be solved because of the people that ultimately worked on it.
JonBenet Ramsey. What comes to mind immediately is injustice. Injustice in that this little girl, a 6-year-old beauty queen from Colorado, murder has never been solved. Never. I think of JonBenet, and unlike probably millions of people who immediately recall her dancing around in a little cowgirl outfit, a pedophile's dream video, I think of injustice. I think of a little girl abused, beaten, and strangled, who died alone in her parents' basement, alone in the sense that no one that truly loved her was with her. I think about evidence that was misinterpreted or overlooked, public pressure, politics, friends of friends of friends, and the case was never solved. I think about a little girl that was objectified, who never really had a full childhood because she was in one beauty contest after the next until she met her death.
There was unidentified DNA, foot and handprints found on the scene, which for all intents and purposes appeared to be staged. The basement window that was supposedly broken and entered by the perpetrator had no foot impressions leading to the window from outside, and the cobwebs all around it were undisturbed. There were many questionable factors that were nonsensical and suspicious, and the Ramseys and their small army of attorneys made the ongoing investigation extremely difficult. Although they cooperated in providing their DNA and prints when asked, It wasn't until 4 months later that they officially sat down and answered police questioning, where many memories of the details may have faded and slowed the progress of the investigation. If they weren't guilty, or in the very least involved, why delay and obstruct the due process? It became an absolute labyrinth of a mystery. But in this video, I want to focus on what I consider to be the crucial information, of which the mass majority are unaware. In early 2000, a then 37-year-old woman named Nancy came forward with insider information that made the most sense about the condition in which JonBenet was found, and what she had good reason to believe had happened in the last moments of her young life, based on her own alleged personal SA experiences with Fleet White Jr., Fleet White Sr., and John Ramsey himself. Nancy to the JonBenet case is like what Ally Carter is to the Diddy case, with the only exception being that it was a different time, when independent media really didn't exist, and for the amount of money John Ramsey was paying to threaten and sue various media outlets to control the public narrative, Nancy's story was very easily buried. Nancy's family had a long shared history with the Whites, but she was able to prove with photo evidence and official legal documentation. Her grandfather's will, for example, was signed by witnesses Fleet White Sr. and his wife Nyla. Nancy's grandmother and Nyla exchanged letters, and Nancy had various photos of different family functions and events showing the close association between the families. Nancy was also able to name off all of the Whites' family members who were never revealed or discussed publicly, as they were not relevant to the Ramsey case, or so they thought. Nancy alleged that her history of SA began as early as she could remember, around the age of 3, firstly by members of her own family, which was enabled by her mother Gwen and stepfather Tom Boykin. She claimed to have been filmed being SA'd by John Ramsey, and that her stepfather's brother, Mackie Boykin, was a key player in these alleged filming arrangements, which she claimed included she and her younger sister, Shirley, as well as Fleet Jr. and his younger sister, Lonnie. Nancy explains that Fleet White Jr. was a child at the time, and was more likely to have been forced to participate in these videos with Nancy and others, but that by the time he was a teenager, and she was still a young child, it had seemed to her that he was more of an active and willing participant. However, Nancy also described that they were all more so forced to comply with threats, punishment, and other forms of psychological warfare and emotional violence, which suggests what may have allegedly been going on with Fleet White III, his younger sister Daphne, as well as Burke and his younger sister JonBenet. In 1980, Mackie Boykin was in fact convicted for his crimes against young Nancy, and the name Fleet White had come up in files associated with the conviction of New Orleans record producer Huey Moe and accomplice Paul Schultz, whom had victimized his own son, Nick Schultz. Nick's story shares many similarities to Nancy's, as confirmed by Paul's ex-wife Belinda Schultz, and investigator of that case, Bill Coulson. These convictions, and the notes and files kept by therapists for both Nick and Nancy, existed long before the JonBenet Ramsey case. So any accusations that they were making these stories up for attention or monetary gain were completely unfounded. She explained that she was in great danger coming forward, and that when details of the Ramsey case became widespread news, she was contacted by Fleet White Sr. and offered $75,000 and an Aspen, Colorado getaway to keep her mouth shut, of which she refused, but agreed not to speak. Eventually, she was encouraged to do so by her longtime therapist, Mary Biankowski, who was well aware of her history and whom was involved ahead of the Ramsey case. I believe she had some kind of duty to come forward with this information, with or without Nancy. Nancy went on to explain that the holidays were the most ideal time to host these types of gatherings, because having many different cars outside one's home overnight was far less suspicious. It was also the perfect excuse to bring all the children together, and that having the Christmas break gave ample time to heal any injuries the children may have sustained during. She goes on to describe the use of asphyxiation in these videos was to emulate climax, and that if they were failing to perform as told, that being struck in the head was most common because it was easier to hide the bruises. Mackie Boykin, who had passed the year prior, was the expert in applying these special effects for film purposes, and that whoever took over for him made a mistake, and JonBenet never regained consciousness. Nancy also alleged that the Santa Claus hired for the enjoyment of the children was in actuality part of the grooming process. The Whites and Ramseys had used the same Santa Claus since 1994. His name was Bill McReynolds, and he had an openly strange affinity towards JonBenet. She had once gifted him with a vial of glitter after giving him a house tour the year prior, and he had mentioned how much he cherished this gift and had wanted it mixed in with his ashes once he passed.
This is Bill McReynolds, the local Santa in town.
There's no way in the world that I could be involved in the death of this little girl. I adored her.
What a perfect suspect. Santa Claus. Wouldn't that have just tied it all up in a nice little bow?
There were a whole host of other possible suspects, ranging from known criminals to friends of the Ramseys.
Who could forget John Mark Carr? Of course. He made quite the headline.
I love JonBenet. Died accidentally.
Are you an innocent man?
No.
Everyone probably around the world knows John Mark Carr.
Her death was an accident.
So you were in the basement?
Yes.
Problem is, he wasn't in Boulder, Colorado when she died, and his DNA didn't match.
And that was it. He was ruled out. What does it say about the state of this case and the possibility of ever solving it?
Did you ever actually meet JonBenet Ramsey in person?
Of course I did.
How many times were you with her?
You know, the description of my connection with her prior to her death is something that I can't discuss, and it's because in knowing a child, you don't just know that child. There are other people involved in knowing a child, and I had to protect the innocent, not the guilty. I can't respond to any details about my connection with her before her death.
But are you saying that you were actually in her company more than once?
Yes.
And what kind of a connection? You talk a lot about the connection you had. Was it a physical connection or a spiritual connection?
It was a connection as in knowing her as a child. I've known hundreds of children, and unfortunately, because there are other people involved in knowing a child, and I wish to protect them, I can't discuss the details of my connection with her. It's unfortunate. I wished I could.
Do you understand why that's confusing for people, though? Because you are very willing to come forward. You came on the show tonight. You did this long article with the AJC this morning. You keep saying you want to talk about things. You want to have this normal life, but you don't answer the questions that people are asking you, the questions that you know they want answered.
There are
why?
reasons. There are reasons, and I just gave you the reason. That's the reason. It's a valid reason, and I'm sticking by it. And you know, the bottom line is, answering all the questions is not what's important to me. Whether someone believes me is not important to me. Protecting people who are innocent is important to me, and I'm going to do it at all costs.
Early on in my career at Court TV, there was a huge moment when John Mark Carr, who was this guy? This bizarre man made this confession, and everyone thought, this is it. This is it. Brought him back from overseas. I think he was in Thailand. He had confessed to all of this, was brought into court. At the time, it was the biggest moment in the history of Court TV, the first time that he was brought into a courtroom here in the United States. And it turned out that was a false confession. You know, they looked at him, they looked at where he was, what he knew, everything, and the pieces just didn't fit. Trust me, they wanted the pieces to fit, but they didn't. And in high-profile cases, you will get false confessions. It's par for the course. It happens. That's why investigators always hold back some information that presumably only the killer would know. So when they get all these confessions, they can somehow corroborate or verify that, oh yeah, you know, he or she knew something that nobody else knew in this case. That wasn't the case with John Mark Carr. So now we're dealing with this other confession. I know it's been making the rounds for a while, but it's a guy named Gary Oliva. All right? He likes pictures of little kids. We know that for a fact, okay? So that gets him into the sphere of people who could potentially be responsible for all this. Now, he's written a series of letters, including ones where he has admitted taking the life of JonBenet Ramsey. He's in custody right now. But he sent these letters, and the question is this for real? Is this a real confession? or the deranged mind of a man making a false confession, like John Mark Carr did years ago. He wrote a letter to a friend of his, a friend, acquaintance, former classmate. His name is Michael Vale. And in that letter, he wrote, "I never loved anyone like I did JonBenet, and yet I let her slip and her head bashed in half, and I watched her die. It was an accident." Okay? That's one of many letters that Gary Oliva has written through the years, to Michael Vale. The man who received those letters from Gary Oliva is former classmate Michael Vale.
So my family went to sleep, and I remember it. You remember a phone call you get that's terrifying. You remember it. You remember the room you're in when you get that phone call. And I remember with the Christmas tree and everything. It was December 26th, and it was about midnight. And I get that phone call, and it's Gary's voice, and he's like, "Oh, I just heard little girl, like it was the most terrifying." I'm getting goosebumps just now telling you guys this because it was terrifying, and I immediately jumped into protective mode. Where are you? What's your address? What's your phone number? And he kind of caught on to me, but he told me he was in Boulder. Well, I was like, Boulder? Why would you be in Boulder? You've been sending me mail for 16 years from Oregon, and now you're suddenly in Boulder calling me. Anyway, he hung the phone up when I'm trying to get information, and that was the phone call. Well, here's the scariest part. The next morning, I get to the LA Times on the newspaper on my front porch. It's 6, 7 in the morning. I flip the newspaper open, and there it is on the back side. It says, "Girl 6 slain in Boulder, Colorado." And I knew something serious had happened that night. I go, wow, he actually killed a girl. And that's when I called that number. Right then and there, I called that phone number. And I sat back, and when you call the police, they're going to do something, right? I mean, that's their job. They investigate tips, right? And here's my solid gold tip. But I sit back, I'm telling my wife, any day they're going to arrest Gary, watch this, it's going to be incredible. And then all of a sudden, like every day would go by, and there's no phone call. I mean, the police never followed up. So after 3 months, I called them a second time. And I said, look, I need to tell you, I've got a really good lead for the John. Now I knew her name was JonBenet. And I said, I've got a lead for the JonBenet murder. And they said, okay, let me put you through to the JonBenet line, quote unquote, the crazy person line, right? Because by now, thousands of people had called, who knows, my tip got buried in there, who knows what happened. I'm still thinking Gary's going to be arrested any day. You talked about John Mark Carr earlier. And let me tell you something. I knew when John Mark Carr got arrested, I knew that I was like, what is this? I mean, I know Gary did this. I know who killed JonBenet. It's an interesting story because in May of 2016, I had enough. I had found Gary's Pinterest page. It was basically a trophy page to JonBenet. There were 65 photos of JonBenet in there. And I just went livid. So I thought, what can I do to help this case along? What can I do? And it was 2016. So I wrote I have a friend who's an FBI agent, sent her a 3-page email. She said, don't worry, I'll take care of it. Within a month, Gary was arrested, and he's got an undetermined sentence. And he's still in prison.
And still in prison now. I mean, the guy clearly has issues and has problems. And the question is he the one responsible for all of this? So you get the letter from him. What do you do with the letters once he starts confessing to you through these letters?
No, the way that happened is that within a month he was arrested, and I was like, oh wow, it was like a backpack full of rocks. It was like relief. I finally was free from worrying about Gary Loose in society. It was the best feeling in the world. And I thought that was enough. That's what I needed, right? And then, but what happened was somebody said, hey, why don't you write Gary a letter and ask him what he did that night? Well, tell me. And I said, that's a brilliant idea. So I started sending Gary's letters. To my surprise, he started sending them back. And I tried everything to try to get him to talk about his life and just about everything, about how this got to this point, you know, and about JonBenet and his obsession with JonBenet. We talked about every detail. And then, what happened is I couldn't get enough details from the letters, so I had him start to call me on the telephone. And I'm recording those calls.
Now, Michael, I understand that you just got another letter today.
Oh, yeah.
From Gary Leva. You mind opening it and tell us what Gary has to say tonight?
I sure do. And I got to tell you, we've got some amazing details coming up. We have a new private investigator that's working with us, and it's really helping this case along. I'm very excited. Okay, so I'm opening this, as you can see. I'm sorry, I should have done that on the... Okay, this is a very, very detailed letter. I haven't reviewed this, but as you can see, let me just approve this, make sure it's okay. It says generosity brings psychological benefits. It's some clipping from it's interesting, you know, the things that he sent me. And now he's kind of changed his handwriting even more, and he writes very small. And, you know, I'll spare you guys. I won't read this to you, but it's been quite a journey for 27 years trying to keep
just
this
give us
guy
a small
out.
flavor of what he wrote, if you could read a couple lines from it.
In the garden, there are patches where others have dumped things of little value that need clearing out and tilled ready for planting. That are patches where no matter one tries to grow, a surface then dies. It never takes hold. Needs the right nutrients. That's where the patches are. That things never get planted at the right time. So you must keep replanting. So it's just bizarre.
Bizarre stuff.
Brad, investigators looked beyond the Ramsey family. In fact, there was some speculation into potential involvement by two local men, correct?
Correct. Here you have Gary Oliva.
He was a homeless man who hung out at a church just a block and a half from the Ramseys' home. And he confessed that he killed JonBenet Ramsey. In fact, he called a friend right after she was killed, crying, sobbing, saying he just killed a little girl.
If you folks are wondering why Gary's constantly asking me if I've opened his letters, if I got his letters, if I've received them, well, the truth is I have. And the truth is that they're very difficult to digest. And I have to get my special letter opener because I don't want to foul any other knives and take these away from my family and actually read these, and trying to let it upset me too much, some of the things that he writes about. And then it goes over here into this satchel. In this satchel, we have all his letters, his artwork, JonBenet on the crucifix, etc., etc. And this special package right here, this right here is the confession letters. And I can't read it to you.
They took a look at him, but eventually eliminated him because there is absolutely no connection between he and the Ramseys, and his DNA, they used that to eliminate him. This is Bill McReynolds, the local Santa in town.
I was the Santa Claus for 3 years at their party, and I always liked the Ramsey party. So I called Patsy in particular and said, it's time for our party.
And apparently JonBenet had made a comment that he, Bill McReynolds, was coming to their house to see JonBenet. I think everybody thought that was a little weird. His DNA didn't match, and he's out of the picture.
In 1974, McReynolds' own daughter and her friend had gone missing on Christmas night, and she witnessed her friend being SA'd. In 1976, Bill's wife wrote a play about a teenager who suffered nearly the same end as JonBenet had, including being SA'd and found in the basement, titled Hey Rube.
And police are also reportedly taking a closer look at Bill McReynolds and his wife. McReynolds played Santa Claus at the Ramseys' Christmas party.
I found them to be very caring,
little girl in particular was very caring.
The Rocky Mountain News reports that police re-interviewed McReynolds and his wife after learning of some eerie parallels to the JonBenet case in the couple's past. In 1974, the McReynolds' then 9-year-old daughter witnessed the sexual molestation of a friend after the two girls were abducted. No arrests were ever made. And in 1976, McReynolds' wife Janet wrote a play about the sexual assault and murder of a girl whose body is found in a basement. Police have no comment on the report. The McReynolds say they had nothing to do with the killing, and the abduction and the play are just coincidences. During a recent interview with Inside Edition, McReynolds displayed a harp with the names of 3 dead children carved into the wood.
When JonBenet was murdered, I thought I would go back to this harp maker and see if I could find a space on here for her.
The claim of Santa Claus costumes being used in a similar context had been mentioned by victims and parents in the McMartin preschool case from the late 80s. The accused had allegedly also been operating in multi-generational succession. The founder, Virginia McMartin, her daughter, Peggy Bucky, and Ray Bucky, Virginia's grandson and Peggy's son, along with 3 of the preschool teachers, were charged with hundreds of counts of child SA. There were many more bizarre claims revealed during that trial that made the SA aspects of the JonBenet case seem mild in comparison. If that all wasn't enough to support what Nancy had claimed, JonBenet's primary photographer, Randall DeWitt Simons, was later convicted of 15 counts of exactly what you think. Randall was whom had sold the JonBenet photographs in bulk to the media after she'd passed. In October of 1998, he was arrested for indecent exposure after he was found wandering around naked in Genoa, Colorado. He exclaimed to officers, "I didn't kill JonBenet," without them having mentioned anything of the sort, and he was never considered a suspect. Even though they knew there was signs of SA, there were so many leads that were completely ignored. The Ramseys' former housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, and her family were investigated for SA material floating around the dark web that closely resembled her husband Merv and their daughter Ariana.
John and Patsy didn't have anything to do with killing that little girl. And if they did, if it's proven that they did, I'll never trust anybody the rest of my life because I never seen anything but a loving, kind, wonderful family.
John Ramsey's oldest daughter, Elizabeth Ramsey, passed in 1992, aged 22, in a car accident. Shortly after, John lost his father, and Patsy was diagnosed with cancer. The earliest years of JonBenet's life, she was mainly cared for by various nannies and babysitters, which not only could have contributed to JonBenet's eagerness to please and gain attention of the adults around her and the approval of her parents, but there were plenty of opportunities for her and Burke to have been SA'd, whether the Ramseys were aware and or involved or not. Multiple leading experts in relation to child SA believed that JonBenet had suffered from chronic abuse, not only due to the physical evidence, but her compulsive bedwetting. She had had 33 doctor's visits in that past year, many being to treat yeast and urinary infections. It was also noted that Burke had bedwetting and behavioral issues as well, including the habit of smearing his feces on JonBenet's toys, walls, and her bed. In fact, the day of her passing, a box of candy was found in her room, covered in feces that was believed to be Burke's. This could just be an indicator of jealousy and resentment, considering the copious amounts of attention JonBenet received, and the fact that she was given a feminized version of their father's name, and their older brother being John Andrew Ramsey. Burke may have felt like the odd one out in other ways as well, that led to destructive and attention-seeking behavior, or a blaring indication that he too was being SA'd.
JonBenet Ramsey!
Did you go to the pageants very much?
Yeah. I mean, I remember like one of the pageant things or something, she just like would go out and just like, you know, like flaunt whatever on stage, and she wasn't shy, I guess.
Right. Did you feel left out of that, or was that okay with you?
No, it's totally fine. I mean, I spent a lot of time with my mom too.
Did your mother have fun with this, or was she a stage mom?
I think she had fun with it. I mean, she did pageants. She was like Miss West Virginia. So I think it was kind of a fun thing.
Was she a pushy type, or did she go with the flow?
I don't remember her being pushy at all.
Yeah. Little girls sometimes get lots of attention.
Yeah.
Did you ever feel like she got all the attention?
No, it was never an issue. I mean, it's just normal to me.
In February of 1997, David Duffy, Enquirer reporter for 21 years, closely covering the essay aspects of the case, was found dead in his hotel room. Around this time, investigators interviewed Miss America in 1958 as an expert, Marilyn Van Derber Atler, who was very outspoken about the abuse she suffered at the hands of her Denver socialite and businessman father between the ages of 5 to 18, and became a strong advocate for familial essay survivors, spreading awareness about the kinds of darkness that can take place behind doors where happy little wreaths are hung. She provided the funding for one of the very first social programs of this variety made available at the Kemp Center. She also founded the Survivors United Network. She's recognized as one of the very first public figures to speak openly on this topic and to join the crusade against complex and what is still considered taboo trauma. She asserts to survivors that the shame is not theirs to bear, and I can agree with that 100%. Children cannot consent. They cannot be considered willing participants regardless of the programming instilled to make them believe it to be so.
I had the honor of being inducted into the East High School Heritage Hall of Fame. And we were asked to go and address students, and we had 2 minutes in which to do that. And there were 1,000 teenagers there, maybe. And I said, when I was at East, I was May Queen. I had the lead in the senior class play. I was in student council. Most of you probably cannot relate to that, but I think you can relate to the fact that when I was your age, my father was coming into my room at night. And when I finished my 2 minutes, they stood up and they applauded and they applauded and they applauded because this is happening to them. Because in one way or another, it may not be their father, uncle, neighbor. This is a part of their lives. It's 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys. And we need to talk about it. And that's why they were clapping, is because, yes, they want to be able to talk about the fact that this happened to you too? Really? Oh. And hopefully after the assembly was over, they began to talk among one another, and perhaps they went home and began to talk about it. He just had total and complete power and control. Would people have believed me as a child in Denver, with who my father was in this community? They would not have believed me. But there are people who don't believe me today. That's what's so shocking to me. There are people who don't believe me. I'm 74, and there are people who don't believe me. There was no safe place for me as a child. I think each of us has a part. I'm trying to do my part to make this world safer for children, have people believe them. That, yes, I believe you. Why would you make this up? I believe you. So many people have asked if my mother knew. I was older than 10 because it was in our new house. My mother always dressed elegantly for bed, and she wore shoes that are called mules. They have a hard heel. My father was in my room. It was 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night, and we didn't hear her coming down the long hallway. But when she started down the linoleum steps, I had the maid's quarters, and there were 3 linoleum steps. First, she very slowly went down on the first step, and then very slowly the second step. Everything stopped, and then the third step. All she had to do was take 6 more steps to be at my bedroom door. I knew finally it would be over. And we heard her step again, only she was going back up the steps. And I knew she would never walk through that door. Did my mother know? 13 years, my mother knew.
Stacy Denton, who had been busking near the Pearl Street Mall for 11 years, in very close proximity to where Access Graphics was located. She was very familiar with the street locals, and claimed that the word on the street was that 3 of her friends had witnessed a man carrying a small child concealed by a garment bag on that night. When news began to spread about the case, these men recognized that man to be John Ramsey. There were further rumored details that these men alleged, with no apparent explanation as to how they came to know these details. But as word got around about what these men claimed to have witnessed, all 3 died mysteriously between the summer and fall of 1997. What they had claimed was that JonBenet's life had ended in the basement of 917 Baseline Road in Boulder, Colorado, that she had been laid out on a pool table, which was the likely match for the green fibers that had been found in her hair. Reports were found to corroborate Stacy's claims. Daniel Julian was found drowned in Boulder Creek in July of 1997. Thomas Lemon was also drowned in Boulder Creek, but in August of 97. And David Emmett Simpson died in September of 1997, but was found in the woods near Boulder Creek. Stacy had then fled Boulder by the third death for fear of her own life, putting two and two together and not believing it to be a coincidence at that point. She went on to claim that during her travels and telling her story, she found that many believed Boulder was occult central, and that it could be confirmed that John Ramsey had occult-related artwork and decor in his offices. She claimed that JonBenet's expiration may have been some type of ritualistic ceremony gone wrong. Stacy's intuition had served her well, because in December of 1997, a 23-year-old Savannah Chase was found partially conscious in an alley between Spruce and Pearl Street and never pulled through. Authorities ruled it as a homicide and believed it to be related to what had happened to Stacy's friend David Emmett Simpson back in September of 1997. The last Stacy was ever heard from was 2007. In August of 1998, there was an article suggesting that former Boulder Police Chief Tom Kobe and District Attorney Alex Hunter were co-conspirators in an alleged child SA material ring that may have been connected to the Ramsey case. This is really the best explanation so far as to why so many parts of this case were mishandled and mismanaged. Could this have been intentional? There were a number of people who quit due to what they felt was purposeful incompetence, and some who quit their law enforcement career altogether.
Thomas resigned in August 1998 to protest what he called the Boulder DA's mishandling of the case. And while this is the first time he's gone public with specifics of his theory, bedwetting as a possible motive is nothing new. The Ramseys addressed it when they spoke with Katie last month.
Another scenario, Patsy, that you flew into a rage over JonBenet's bedwetting.
There again, what are your priorities? JonBenet would have an occasional accident. It was nothing to be alarmed at. I didn't care one way or the other. I would not have ever. It's just ludicrous. You can't even answer it.
As for the ransom note, Thomas says everyone whose handwriting was tested was excluded, except Patsy Ramsey. Not so, say the Ramseys.
There are lots of pieces of handwriting that we have of other suspects that match much more closely than mine does.
We had the note looked at by national experts in handwriting, and they told us the same thing. They said it's a very low probability of comparison that Patsy's writing compares. Very low probability that she would have been the writer.
Thomas also discloses surprising details about the investigation, such as the fact that Boulder detectives broke into the cemetery where JonBenet is buried and planted a hidden microphone and camera a few feet from JonBenet's grave, hoping they might overhear a graveside confession. All they got were some curious sightseers and a salesman who sold a burial plot to an elderly couple. These sort of disclosures and opinions aren't sitting well with many in Boulder. Alex Hunter, the district attorney who calls Thomas a tormented soul, urged caution with regard to Thomas's conclusions.
He didn't have the background and the sort of the depth of understanding that several of the other detectives did. I don't think detectives ought to be writing books.
Once people who may have been connected to the case started having their lights turned out, and with all of the efforts being made to deter the case from the SA angle, it would seem that those who were most interested in the truth and justice were being backed into a corner, which may suggest there was something much more at risk of being revealed if this specific angle continued to be pursued. I should also mention that John Ramsey's corporate lawyer for Access Graphics, Michael Bynum, had formerly worked as a deputy in the district attorney's office in the 70s. Bynum worked with both Alex Hunter and Peter Hofstrom, who were the Boulder district attorney and head of the DA's felony division, respectively. Fleetwhite Jr. visited Bynum's office in the evening of December 26, 1996, mere hours after JonBenet's body was found. Additionally hired was a legal team from Haddon, Morgan, and Foreman, a small firm in Denver, Colorado. Attorneys Jeffrey Pagluka and Laura Menninger were later part of Ghislaine Maxwell's legal team. For being an even more wealthy and powerful individual, it seems interesting to me that Ghislaine would select that particular firm, and those lawyers specifically, to represent her in her trial relating to crimes against minors. To make the plot even thicker, there was even a photo of JonBenet that internet sleuths discovered, which appeared to have Ghislaine in the background. Although the Ramsey family friends were quite public and open about their closeness, John's business friendships were mainly kept separately. It was Michael Bynum and restaurant business partner Jay Alowski who all ended up living near each other and staying in the closest contact after Patsy had passed and John Ramsey remarried. In January of '98, Bynum formed an investment group called 755 15th Street, LLC, where he and a handful of other Ramsey associates purchased the Ramsey home for well under market value. It was rumored that some wild parties were being thrown there after it changed ownership. Bynum was also tasked with filing the paperwork for the JonBenet Ramsey Children's Foundation. Sometimes the answers are in plain sight, and sometimes there's intentional misdirection. The Alowskis and the Bynums were not invited to any of the family Christmas parties hosted by the Ramseys or the Whites, for example. But the three had relocated to the middle of bumfuck nowhere of Moab, Utah, which of course was the perfect place to open another Pasta Jay's restaurant location, co-owned by John and Jay. I'd also like to mention that there's one of those FLDS communities just outside of Moab called Rockland Branch. Some of these groups are practicing plural marriages, void of any age of consent. Some are interfamilial, and some are transported and traded with other communities. Warren Jeffs and Samuel Bateman are two community leaders, or prophets, I should say, according to their ideology, are currently in prison for crimes against children. In April of 2024, Bateman pled guilty to charges that related to orchestrating the transport and trade of minors, some of which who were abducted from state care facilities. At the time of his arrest, Bateman had more than 20 wives, and more than half of them were under the age of 15, the youngest being 9. Group activities were performed in front of other children so they could learn, and many of these sessions were videotaped and or live streamed, which turned profits or favors. Bateman also accepted trades. One man gave him 2 Bentleys, and another a Range Rover. This was all within a 2-year span, when he took over for Warren Jeffs after his arrest. Warren Jeffs is one of the most prolific prophets among the FLDS groups. He had nearly 80 wives, dozens who were not adults, had been facilitating relationships and marriages between adult men and children for decades. His reign of trauma and terror spanned between 1986 to 2002, using psychological warfare to maintain control and power, which luckily came to an end. But where one prophet ends, another one begins. There's still many of these kinds of communities in existence to this day. That too seems to be part of the bigger picture about where many of these missing kids and teens may be ending up. The secrecy and security surrounding these communities is fairly extreme, and for how these communities appear and operate, and with how quickly they multiply having so many wives, it would be easy to blend new additions into their cookie-cutter groups. They all wear the same outfits and hairstyles. The only difference of the women's clothing is color, which is reportedly to reflect their rank and position within the community. Men, on the other hand, are not allowed to have beards. They're all conveniently located very near or on state and border lines, and generally have majority control over the townships they populate. They are isolated, brainwashed, and face cruel and brutal punishments if they do not obey, in some ways using near military level tactics to maintain control. Which brings us to Cathy O'Brien, another survivor, not only of interfamilial abuse, but who claims she was trafficked and used to create essay material and alleges to have been sold into a covert military project that offered abusers immunity in exchange to have their children entered into a trauma-based behavioral and mind control program.
A lot of people didn't have a point of reference for it, especially back in 1995. A lot more have a point of reference for it today. But so I never really anticipated a response, and I certainly didn't expect a warm one. My father supplemented the family income with the proceeds from child pornography, which was being sold through the local Michigan Mafia child pornography ring. It was well established and was being sanctioned by a criminal faction of the government that was targeting children like myself for mind control. The dissociative disorder that I suffered from was something that any child that was being used in pornography would have, and is a strong basis for mind control. He was aware on all levels of what it was about and exactly what it was for, what it would entail, and he would say, even way back then, he'd say things like, spies are made, not born, and so he knew that I would have to be made, and he'd been taught how to raise me in the project according to conditioning me with childhood themes and continuing abuse and taking me to certain places according to the instructions of the political people that were directing his actions. When trauma occurs, the brain actually compartmentalizes the memory of the event so the rest of the mind can function normally. And since the dissociative disorder is defined as the mind's sane defense to trauma too horrible to comprehend, the occultism was certainly too horrible to comprehend, as was the incest and the sexual abuse. So it was actually creating more compartments in my mind, and the more compartments that were created, the less of me there was. And then pretty soon I was just operating with no conscious awareness of what had happened before, what was going to happen, and I began living only in the moment and operating on a subconscious level, which left me highly suggestible to where I would do exactly what I was told to do rather than think to go do something on my own. When my father was first approached by Gerald Ford, he was earning his living as a worm digger, and he had a 6th grade education, and he wasn't a real intelligent or ambitious type person, and he didn't have the kind of drive and self-esteem that would take him any further, except for the fact that by the time I was 13 and he decided where money would be appropriated, and when my father sold me into the project, he received lucrative military contracts that worked in a parts manufacturing camshafts for military vehicles, and ultimately made him extremely wealthy just because of selling his children into the project. Well, I knew that Senator Byrd was my owner. Like the first time that I was with him, I knew that he would be my owner. I didn't think of him so much as an owner, as someone who was directing my activities from that point. He would decide where I would be taken and when, who would be my handlers. Of course, my father was my handler until I became of legal age. At 18, my handler was Wayne Cox, as appointed by Senator Byrd. Senator Byrd wanted Wayne Cox to be my handler because he was already involved in government operations, especially where mercenaries were concerned, where the CIA covert operations were concerned, and he was also a part of an extreme trauma base. Stun guns were the most commonly used form of trauma for mind control, and it was a tool that could be used outside of the major programming centers to drop me, to transport me into different places, to compartmentalize memory. It was used by various escorts. My handler, predominantly Alex Houston, used a stun gun all the time. It was used by Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino of the Psychological Warfare Division, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he was the founder of the occult temple of Set. Before harmonics were used so strongly, the prod marks were heavily used, to the point where ever the stun gun prod marks would be raised up on a person and strategic places would be indicative of the form of operation that they were to be used in. For example, the ones that were located on the left side of the face was usually indicative of some kind of message delivery or a photographic recording that could be going on by the program person. The ones on the throat were indicative of programming, oral programming. The different places where they were located were clear indicators to people in the know what kind of mode of operation I was working in. The most traumatic thing that I ever endured was not being able to protect my daughter. And it was always a trauma base for me. It was an extreme trauma base because it went against my maternal instincts. Everything that I had hoped for as a child, everything that I am inside, to want to love her and protect her and take good care of her and give her a wonderful and safe environment, and I couldn't do that. I couldn't think to do that. I was born into the project on a level where she was subjected to high-tech mind control programming on a harmonic level literally from birth. I developed compartmentalization from trauma. She developed it from the harmonics, which actually vibrates the neuron pathways instead of having the trauma create the compartmentalization. So since she had that so early on, she was also receptive to anything that was put in there and would photographically remember it when triggered open, and that would include this incredible vocabulary that she had at such an early age. I became aware that I didn't know what had happened to over 10 years of my life at all. I had no recollection at all, totally amnesic. I even thought I was still 24 years old when I was actually 30 years old. So those things all lent to the very beginning of beginning to remember. And as I began to remember, Mark taught me a method that was very effective to recall what's incomprehensible. Since the disorder that I had was resulting from trauma too horrible to comprehend, it had to be made comprehensible in order to take those walls down in my mind and take the compartmentalization down. So in order for it to be comprehensible, the best way was to deal with it logically. Emotionally, there's no place for the kind of horror that my daughter and I experienced, but logically I began to understand, and the logic was accessed by writing out my memories. When a person moves a pen, the logic portion of their brain is what actually controls the pen, so automatically the memory is shifted over to logic and comes out on paper, and it's a very very safe and an easy way of being able to remember what was actually photographically recorded.
This is in and of itself a really fully loaded topic, and I encourage you to do your own research on the matters and draw your own conclusions in all regards. But some of the evidence in the Ramsey case was concealed, as it was considered to be a threat to national security, including this stun gun instructional video that was found at the Ramsey home.
Now, when it comes to this stun gun instructional video found in the Ramsey's home, Cathy states that high-profile attorney Alan Dershowitz referred to this military video found in the Ramsey home that it was censored under national security. The Ramseys have addressed this video that was found in their house in their book, Death of Innocence, on page 195, writing, quote, "Later in July, I had learned that stun guns can be bought at spy shops. I remembered that Patsy and I had attended a Super Bowl game in Miami in 1994 as guests of Sun Microsystems. On Saturday morning, we had gone out for a walk in the small village of Coral Gables with no other intention than doing a little window shopping, and happened to pass by a spy shop that sold goods for security and monitoring. Several times in the past, I had wondered if a competitor might tap our telephones at the office and get sensitive information that could be used against us in business. Not that our competitors would do that, but I don't know that they wouldn't either. This particular shop in Coral Gables carried hidden cameras, bugging equipment, security devices, and everything under the sun that a person concerned with security might want. I learned that it was not easy to detect a phone tap on a complex phone system, such as the one we had at Access. I also got a sales pitch on some other things that they sold. As we left, the clerk gave me a videotape catalog to take home. When I returned to Boulder, I threw it in a drawer and completely forgot about the tape. I surmised that the police went through everything in our house. They found the video catalog, which apparently turned out to have an advertisement for, you got it, stun guns. Not too long after the police reported to the media that they had found a stun gun, quote, instructional video, end quote, in the Ramsey house. So on the one hand, they were supporting the stun gun theory, but on the other hand, they were now indirectly saying that I had used this weapon on my daughter. Of course, for a period of time, the video created a significant uproar and cast further suspicion on me.
Another factor in Lou Smith's investigation, two strange marks on JonBenet's face and back.
The marks themselves, both on the back and on the face, were the same distance apart. Suddenly a little light went on, and it was just like, wait a minute, it was a stun gun.
Smith looked at other murders where a stun gun was known to have been used. He examined images of a crime victim who had a known stun gun injury.
And the marks are very similar to the face of JonBenet.
He also looked into an experiment performed using stun guns on pigs. These marks were also the same as the marks found on JonBenet.
When we did the pigs, We get perfect marks, just almost like on the back of JonBenet.
Lou Smith is probably the most experienced homicide detective in Colorado. He was brought into the Ramsey case by the district attorney after the DA's office lost confidence in the Boulder Police Department. Smith developed his own theory of the case that widened the gap with the police department. He became convinced that a stun gun, like this one, was used on JonBenet. A stun gun delivers an electric shock that incapacitates the victim. Smith noticed marks, reproduced in the sketch, on the autopsy photographs of JonBenet's body. The autopsy report referred to them simply as abrasions, but they reminded Smith of a previous stun gun case. There were 2 sets of marks on JonBenet's body, and when Smith calibrated their measurements, he felt they matched up with this popular stun gun model, the air taser. He felt the stun gun was used, and that's what kept JonBenet quiet, but there is no proof of that.
Well, I have not heard any expert disagree with that theory.
Well, some of the police do not think there was a stun gun.
I don't consider Boulder police experts in homicides. That's one of the problems we've been dealing with.
Unless some other evidence is presented to me, the most likely explanation for those injuries is that they were caused by a stun gun.
The Ramseys deny owning one. But New Yorker magazine says police found a stun gun instructional video in the Ramsey house.
Later, we got a copy of the video catalog from the store in Coral Gables and found it was recorded in Spanish. Not only had I never reviewed the tape, but if I had, I wouldn't have understood it. According to the Ramseys, this video was really just a catalog that they had picked up at a spy shop that happened to have an advertisement for stun guns in it. Nothing to see here, folks. Besides, what am I alleging here? That John and Patsy Ramsey were CIA assets participating in this behavioral mind control program? That seems a little far-fetched, don't you think? And yes, it is far-fetched, but nothing about this case is straightforward or typical. And is it me, or did something always feel a little bit off about these two?
Cathy O'Brien strongly believes that the video was a military instructional video called How to Create a Mind Control Slave Using a Stun Gun, of which she can confirm its existence as she was used as the demonstrational subject in this video. U.S. Army Ranger and Dark Temple affiliate Colonel Michael Aquino led this instructional video, which was filmed in Huntsville, Alabama.
So this is a confirmed fact that a stun gun instructional video was found in the Ramsey household. According to Cathy O'Brien, this was a military instructional video called How to Create a Mind-Controlled Slave Using a Stun Gun. She states that she is the victim in the video, and it was filmed in Huntsville, Alabama by U.S. Army Ranger Colonel Michael Aquino.
On this altar is one of a number of daggers, which we may use in our rituals. This one happens to belong to the commanding general of the most elite unit of Germany's infamous SS, which was concerned with black magic and occultism research in general. Anything that it could find that had to do with the origins of the human race, destiny of humanity.
The perverted view of the occult held by Heinrich Himmler was of an evil magic that could help create a new master race. Wewelsburg Castle is where he performed his ceremonies.
I have been to the Wewelsburg, which still preserves Heinrich Himmler's ritual chambers to this day, and have conducted a black magical ritual in the so-called Hall of the Dead beneath the Wewelsburg. This particular dagger is inscribed to our comrade in the Leibstandarte Theodor Wisch, Brigadeführer, a major general in the Waffen-SS. And on its blade, it bears the inscription, Mein Ehre heißt Treu, or my honor shall be known by my faithfulness.
Cathy has done many interviews and presentations regarding her experience and published a handful of books. These programs were confirmed to exist, and we must start listening closer to alleged victims of the operational and applicable use of these mind and body manipulation tactics, experimented with and perfected over time. It is progress that the mass majority is beginning to absorb the stories of alleged victims, like Allie Carter, in relation to now. But none of this is new, and we're still only scratching the surface. Other survivors have identified Michael Aquino as instrumental in their sadistic programming, including Nick Schultz, Brice Taylor, and Paul Bonacci.
I was
created by a government program.
Which government program?
Monarch.
And what is Monarch?
Monarch is an operation that was created by the United States government to create spies for other countries. They use children for the purpose that they are easily integrated into multiple personalities because they can dissociate. Monarch is a program that is run by Michael Angelo Aquino, who was an Army Reserve colonel at Presidio. He is also the leader of the Temple of Set. He also runs a child daycare center. He also is involved in human sacrifice.
Is he employed by the United States?
Yes,
At what facility?
Presidio, California.
Is that in San Francisco area? Presidio
Yes.
Naval Base?
Yes.
Do you know what rank Michael Aquino holds?
He was a colonel.
Is he currently employed there?
I am not aware of the current situation.
Did you understand Mr. Aquino to be working on behalf of the United States or against the United States?
I believed he was working on behalf of the United States.
If you want to dive deeper into that rabbit hole, I gotta recommend you my newest favorite creator. And that's a big deal, because I don't really consume much content. Aside from watching interviews and content directly relating to whatever I'm researching at the time. But I came across Miss Desi Zealous on TikTok a while back, and she's had me absolutely captivated by her flavor of conspiracy analyst. First off, as you can see, her color-coded board of entertainment. I know it looks like craziness to the naked eye, but it's actually brilliant and so comprehensive. It tickles my brain in all the right places. Desi's just launched the first episode of her podcast, and will be doing a serious deep dive in the Ramsey case that I highly recommend. Her attention to detail is incredible, and I'm pleased that I have a chance to shout her out here. She grew up in a military household, and is going in hard on that side, as well as the secret society influences. Her first episode is now available, and it's around 2 hours long just on Patsy Ramsey and her family background alone, where I'm mainly exploring the essay aspects of the JonBenet case. But if you want more, Desi has the meat, veggies, and potatoes. All her links will be in the description, and she'll also be creating YouTube-friendly versions of her podcast episodes very soon. So make sure to subscribe to her No Idols, No Masters channel.
When her father died, he let us know exactly what the fuck's going on here. He let us know where all those little breadcrumbs throughout the years, he sealed it into a loaf. And we're going to get into it. You know, I don't have to go on a detour. I don't have to show you guys every single time where all of these same elements were at play. We're going to stick with the Ramsey. And it wouldn't just be the military background and the conflicting stories on how these two meet. The fairy tale romance, secrecy makes sense. And then when you take into account these two, especially this one, how the image is constructed, the secrecy, the pathological lying that happened well before JonBenet tragic unaliving, well, you know, there were so many signs. There's so many signs. Just like seeing, like, oh, Freemasons are in the chat. Central Intelligence is in the chat. The military is in the chat. White supremacy is in the chat. How many things are in the chat? Uh-oh.
Now here's where things get interesting. Cathy alleges that as Miss West Virginia, Patsy had ties to Robert C. Byrd, who was the senator for West Virginia for a very long time, and who also happened to be Cathy's owner. She also states that John Ramsey had connections to her father. So Cathy grew up in Muskegon, Michigan, which is interesting because the Ramseys had a house in Charlevoix. There is apparently a manifest that documents John Ramsey and Cathy's father, Earl O'Brien, on the same ferry ride from Traverse City, Michigan to Beaver Island, which is just off the coast of Charlevoix, where the Ramseys have a vacation home.
Cathy O'Brien and her daughter were allegedly victimized within this program, and not only survivors, but some conspiracy analysts believe that both Patsy and JonBenet were strategically placed under someone's control in service of the same kind of program. With John's strong military ties and powerful connections, it'd be foolish for us to not consider this crucial information.
Patsy was born just 1 year before Cathy in December of 1956. As Cathy describes in her book Transformation of America, it's quite common for ultra handlers to cross-program between mother and daughter, and that seems to be somewhat evident between Patsy and JonBenet. Also, just a side note, she died on June 24th, 2006, reportedly of ovarian cancer, and I just have to point out that this date, when added up, adds up to 666, so do with that what you will.
If even 10% of what any of these survivors says is true, it's truly appalling, and we can no longer remain ignorant to the great big elephant in the room. It was Alan Dershowitz who publicly referred to the instructional video in the Ramsey home as being censored under national security. Dershowitz was part of Jeffrey Epstein and Harvey Weinstein's defense team, and take a wild guess who else he's defended.
Well, I'll never forget, I was having dinner, this is a name-dropping story, but I was having dinner with Bill and Hillary Clinton at the home of Caroline Kennedy on Martha's Vineyard. And suddenly, Bill Clinton was called away, and he picked up the phone, and he was talking on the phone for 10 minutes, off on the side. And then he came over to me and he said, Alan, somebody wants to talk to you. And he hands me the phone, and it's Jeffrey Epstein. This was obviously, before any of these things came out, it was while Clinton was still president, probably in about 1999. But obviously, he was friendly with Bill Clinton. He was friendly with Bill Gates. He was friendly with many, many, many people. He was Rothschild, who raved about him and told me he was the most wonderful man in the world.
Dershowitz first gained public notoriety for defending film distributor Harry Reams for adult film Deep Throat in 1976 on the grounds of First Amendment rights and asserting that the consumption of this kind of material was not harmful.
But it turned out that the movie he helped make was Deep Throat, one of the all-time big money winners in the hard circuit. The feds decided this time to move and invoked a law against commerce and obscenity. They nabbed him in Memphis, prosecuted him, and he was found guilty. As could have been predicted, his case has been transmuted into a free speech case, and he's got professors from here and there saying if Harry Reams goes to jail, so will the author of the Song of Solomon or anybody else who writes about smog in Los Angeles. The lead lawyer in the case is Mr. Alan Dershowitz, professor of law at Harvard, graduate of the Yale Law School, of Brooklyn College, former clerk. Mr. Reams has been doing the lecture circuit to raise money to pay his legal bills and making the case for the First Amendment, rather like Fannie Hill, arguing in favor of the Interstate Commerce Clause. I'd like to begin by asking Mr. Dershowitz whether he has pitched to the porno tycoons for the legal expenses.
No. First of all, the legal expenses are very much a part of the whole problem in the case. The strategy of the government often is to, knowing that they're going to lose the battle, hope to win the war by financially bankrupting those who would make films of this kind or of others in the same genre.
This film, starring Linda Lovelace, was created under force and duress, and is acknowledged as genuine rape on film.
The story behind the person known as Linda Lovelace, star of the film Deep Throat, is a story of a prostitute who became an international celebrity. Behind the scenes, it's a story of horror, violence, and degradation. Our guest is Linda Marciano. She's married with 2 children. Good to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
When people think about you, and they think about Deep Throat and that experience so far in your past, and they say things like, you might not hear it, but, you know, well, she seemed to enjoy it. She wanted to be there. Does that make you really angry?
That one makes me especially angry. They always say, they talk about the smile on my face, but nobody ever mentions the bruises on my body or questions them. You know, that's frustrating.
Linda has thoroughly chronicled her abuse and how she was forced into the adult film industry by Chuck Traynor, who used firearms and other cruel and threatening means to force her to perform. In 1986, Michael Aquino was under investigation for SA in connection to the Army's Child Development Center at the Presidio of San Francisco. 58 of the 100 children who attended the daycare center showed physical and mental signs of SA, including several children having contracted chlamydia and other STDs and STIs. A lawsuit in excess of $60 million was filed by parents, but after suspicious cases of arson destroyed the facilities and evidence, it was found that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. Aquino was also found to have connections to the Franklin conspiracy in Nebraska related to Boys Town, and with similar accusations. But once again, the case was dismissed in 1990.
Respected law enforcement professional, recently or retired now from the FBI, former regional director of Los Angeles. Do you, sir, believe that these dreadful allegations of babies being sacrificed are true?
I absolutely believe it, without any doubt. Based on the information that's been given to me across the country by numerous survivors and by confidential sources and informants.
Then why don't you name these people and arrest them? Never a name, never an arrest. These women come out of a group and they insist that they know the people in the group, and yet they do not identify these large mysterious cults. Name them and arrest them and get them off the street.
Does he not make a valid point?
He makes a valid point. The problem with that is, number one, police officers don't believe it. I may believe it. You may believe it. Some people in your audience may believe it. They don't believe it. Number two, if you decide to investigate these people, you have to, number one, handle it from an undercover operation. If you put an undercover operation into effect, then you have, in a sense, your own police officers become involved in these heinous crimes, and they are, of course, become murderers. And in addition to that, if you do decide to investigate these people, it's a lot of work. And many law enforcement officers are apathetic and don't want to get involved.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard this. The debate here could rage over this issue alone for hours and hours and hours. Michael Aquino is right when he says there have not been any successful prosecutions for this horrible allegation. Ted Gunderson is a sincere man with a good reputation who says that there are difficulties in the prosecution. Still, the point is it has never been proven in a court of law. Obviously, it needs more investigation, but if these things are happening, then there should be a national task force of federal and state and local cops working together to prove or disprove. Because this is just unacceptable, this impasse.
There was plenty of evidence to point to either someone in the family or very close to the family. They had to know the layout of the house, and to be that comfortable spending nearly 30 minutes to write out a ransom note tells us it was highly unlikely to be a stranger. Statistically speaking, child SA is generally committed by someone in or close to the family. From what Nancy claimed, whose family seemed to be just about as close to the White family as the Ramseys, and there being a prior conviction to support her claims, these allegations should have been taken a lot more seriously.
It's not unlike a father who enjoyed playing baseball as a child. He wants to impart that same love of the game with his son or daughter. There's just absolutely nothing wrong with it.
They called JonBenet a 6-year-old Lolita, a punt-sized kitten.
The people that look at these things and see something perverted, that didn't come from JonBenet. That's coming from the viewer, not the child. Little girls dress up and play dress up.
You yourself had entered beauty contests.
Yes.
I'm a junior at West Virginia University.
So this was, what, fun for you both
It
to
was
have to
the
do
most
this?
wonderful time of my life.
Whether certain aspects were staged or manipulated to throw off investigators, which made things more complicated or not, there was more than enough evidence that suggested that JonBenet had been essayed before that night, and that should have been more thoroughly investigated as well. When Nancy was speaking with police, there was a missing persons report filed for her by someone in her family. The departments communicated, and Nancy was very concerned that her whereabouts had been revealed and believed it put her in even greater danger. She had even mentioned early in her series of interviews that it was a risk for her to be speaking to them. The Whites then took a vested interest in finding out exactly what Nancy had said, although maintaining that whatever she said was nonsense, If it was nonsense, as many of the tip line calls and allegations turned out to be, why would they take a particularly special interest in Nancy?
My name is Fleet White, and I live at 4350 Comanche Drive in Boulder. My wife, Priscilla, and I have lived in Boulder since 1994. On Christmas Day, 1996, John and Patsy Ramsey and their children, Burke and JonBenet, were dinner guests at our home. The next day, we were present at the Ramsey home when JonBenet's body was found. Priscilla and I and our children instantly became witnesses in the Boulder police investigation of JonBenet's death. We eventually became publicly critical of then Boulder District Attorney Alex Hunter's handling of that investigation. And in 1998 and 1999, we cooperated with prosecutors and gave sworn testimony to the Boulder grand jury. As was publicly revealed last fall, the Ramseys were indicted on felony charges related to JonBenet's death. The indictments, however, were not presented in open court in accordance with Colorado law. Instead, at the conclusion of the grand jury in October 1999, District Attorney Hunter, along with numerous Boulder and Colorado law enforcement and government officials who were privy to the grand jury proceedings, chose to keep the indictment secret and then make public pronouncements that were designed to mislead the public to conclude the grand jury had failed to indict. On February 25, 2000, only 4 months following Mr. Hunter's public deceptions regarding the grand jury proceedings, he conspired with the Boulder Daily Camera to take the extraordinary step of publishing a front-page headline story of an unidentified woman from California who had come forward with claims that, quote, if true, could mean the Ramsey case is tangled in sexual abuse and involves more people than originally thought, end quote. The woman was soon publicly identified as Nancy Krebs. The Daily Camera story triggered widespread speculation that I was involved in JonBenet's death and had committed crimes spanning decades involving child abuse and child pornography. Prodded by Mr. Hunter and the Daily Camera, the Boulder police conducted a wasteful 11-week investigation of Ms. Krebs' false claims and allegations that concluded with a May 15, 2000 city press release that states the investigation had found no evidence to support Ms. Krebs' beliefs that JonBenet had been murdered by a, quote, end quote. Otherwise, the city offered the public no information regarding the investigation of the woman's veracity and did nothing to dispel speculation caused by the Daily Camera article regarding alleged crimes unrelated to JonBenet's death by members of our family. The defamation spawned by Mr. Hunter and the Daily Camera in 2000 was then and continues to be devastating to our family. We have absolutely no doubt the Daily Camera and Mr. Hunter exploited Ms. Krebs and published the article with the intent of casting suspicion on our family in relation to JonBenet's death, destroying our reputations and credibility as police and prosecution witnesses in the investigation and grand jury proceedings, and silencing us as critics of Mr. Hunter.
Your time is up.
Thank you. My better half's going to have some additional time.
Thank you. Priscilla White?
My name is Priscilla White. I live at 4350 Comanche Drive in Boulder. I am married to Fleet White, who spoke previously on this same matter. In 2002, as some of you may recall, we asked the city for police records regarding the 2000 investigation of Ms. Krebs' claims. That request was denied, and we brought an action in district court under the Colorado Criminal Justice Records Act. Following a hearing, the court released 285 pages of transcriptions of the women's police interviews detailing her absurd and false accusations of sexual abuse by members of our family that had been the basis for the 2000 Daily Camera publications. The court, however, did not release any records concerning the investigations of Ms. Krebs' fabrications. In 2011, we again asked the city for the investigative file. That request was denied. On February 19th of this year, following the revelations concerning the Ramsey indictments, we once again asked the city to inspect and copy the police files regarding the Krebs investigation that was concluded nearly 14 years ago. Once again, the city has refused. Yesterday, we received an email from the Boulder City Attorney threatening that if we ask the district court for an order requiring the city to show cause for its refusal, the city will consider such application to be, quote, frivolous, groundless, and vexatious, end quote, and seek sanctions against us from the court. We have nonetheless filed with the court a complaint, an application for order to show cause, and we have faith that the Boulder District Court will ignore any such claim by the city and issue an order for the city to show cause for its refusal to allow public access to the Krebs investigation records. To be clear, we seek investigative records from the city that may provide our family vindication from Ms. Krebs' false claims and accusations as detailed in the interview transcriptions publicly released by the court in 2002. We also seek a measure of transparency regarding the motives and actions of those who engaged in or abetted attempts to destroy our family simply because we posed a threat to their interests in relation to the JonBenet Ramsey homicide investigation. 20 years ago, we picked Boulder as a place to raise our young family, and over the years, this community has given us a mixture of blessings and burdens. Among the burdens has been our experience as Boulder police witnesses in the JonBenet Ramsey homicide investigation. Cooperating with law enforcement officers by telling everything you know or don't know about the commission of a crime is something that all citizens should be prepared to do. That is what our family did when we did so without any expectations other than to hope that whoever was responsible for JonBenet's death would be brought to justice. Instead, it was our family who were publicly branded as murderers, torturers of young children, pedophiles, and perjurers. We ask that this council apprise itself of the facts and issues underlying this matter and, after consideration, cause the public release of criminal justice records as we requested.
Thank you.
We already know the Ramseys were threatening legal action, filing lawsuits, and spending a great deal of money on their team of attorneys and investigators who seem to be running interference in the investigation of the case rather than doing everything in their power to help law enforcement determine what exactly had happened and who was responsible.
Brianne, this is the second lawsuit filed in the last few months surrounding this television series. The latest lawsuit was filed right here today in Wayne County Circuit Court. We had the chance to talk to that attorney. He's based out of Atlanta, and he had plenty to say.
They did it for ratings, during tweets, and they did it for profit.
The lawyer for Burke Ramsey not holding back at all when talking to Action News tonight about the latest lawsuit against CBS. The older brother of JonBenet Ramsey going after the network for $750 million after a television series in September concluded he was the one to kill his 6-year-old sister.
CBS needs to be taught a lesson that it will never, in its corporate light, forget. And other members of the media need to be mindful of that lesson.
I believe there can be many different true things happening simultaneously, and that nothing is black and white. I also believe that when you consider JonBenet's fame and notoriety in the pageant world, she likely attracted just as much perverse attention as she did the awe and admiration of the judges and other pageant mothers, if not more so. Her open and personable nature, willingness to please and gain approval of the adults around her, and having nobody really protecting her and looking out for her best interest beyond her being some kind of dress-up doll or ornament.
Factor in that they were wealthy, well-educated. Patsy was a beauty contest winner. They had it all.
I want to be a cowboy sweetheart.
When it was revealed that JonBenet was in beauty pageants at such a young age, and the ugly underbelly of that world was revealed, it didn't help.
Although there wasn't enough tangible evidence to charge the Ramseys, the grand jury had indicted them on grounds of basically facilitating her abuse, which eventually led to the outcome of that night.
The grand jury had recommended that indictments should be brought against both John and Patsy Ramsey. And the district attorney, Alex Hunter, just ignored it. How often do you think that's done?
Given the possible repercussions, we agreed to alter his voice and put his face in shadow.
Before you were a grand juror, what did you know about the JonBenet Ramsey case?
Very little. I saw that there was a little girl dressed up with, in my opinion, a sexual persona, and it disgusted me, and I turned off the TV.
Over the course of more than a year, he and the other grand jurors grappled with the evidence and testimony from dozens of witnesses. The whole jury even took a field trip to the Ramsey home on 15th Street.
In the basement where she was found, it was actually kind of an obscure layout, and you had to go into, you come down the stairwell and you had to go into another room to find the door that was closed. It was a very eerie feeling. It's like someone had been killed here.
A grand jury does not decide guilt or innocence, only whether there is probable cause to charge someone with a crime.
Probable cause means there's enough for us to move forward. The difference between getting an indictment versus proof beyond a reasonable doubt is a huge difference.
Was there enough evidence to indict John and Patsy Ramsey of a crime?
Based upon the evidence that was presented, I believe that's correct.
But if the case went to trial, did he believe that the Ramseys would be convicted?
No.
No doubt.
There's no way that I would be able to say beyond reasonable doubt this is a person.
There was no smoking gun.
Not to the point of knowing exactly what happened or exactly who was involved, no. And if you're a district attorney, if you know that going in, it's a waste of taxpayer dollars to do it.
Still, the grand jury handed up an indictment accusing John and Patsy Ramsey of not murder, but child abuse, finding they allowed JonBenet to be placed in a situation which resulted in death.
At least 9 of those jurors felt there was probable cause to believe that that crime occurred. In saying that, they were also saying, I can't tell who did what. I'm not ready to say there's probable cause to believe that either John Ramsey or Patsy Ramsey intentionally and deliberately murdered their child.
After a year and a half of investigation, the stakes could not have been higher for the district attorney or the Ramseys.
We were prepared to drive to the sheriff's office, turn ourselves in, and be jailed. I had signed a custodial agreement that would put Burke in the custody of my brother.
We had to prepare in the event the worst happened. And that is a daunting thought. I mean, when you're packing your suitcase saying, well, what does one take when one might end up in jail?
But in an astonishing turn of events, the prosecutor nullified the findings of his own grand jury, the criminal justice equivalent of, oh, never mind.
I must report to you that I and my prosecution task force believe we do not have sufficient evidence to warrant the filing of charges against anyone who has been investigated at this time.
The investigative team was reassigned, and basically all leads regarding the essay aspects of the Ramsey case were abruptly abandoned, where at first the detectives were diligently pursuing leads provided by alleged victim/witness Nancy. They suddenly found some kind of confirmation that part of her story was untrue, and therefore dismissing all other substantial evidence supporting her claims. She had said at one point that her mother alluded to having been at the Whites' Christmas dinner in 1996, and that she'd brought Nancy's niece along for the festivities. But it's possible this information was suggested to be the potential hole in the story if and when Nancy did finally decide to speak up. If her mother was indeed an accomplice of continued crimes against children, beyond turning a blind eye to Nancy's step-uncle Mackie and others abusing her, she would absolutely have motive to taint Nancy's statements. Investigators were certain that Gwen had not attended the Christmas dinner with Nancy's niece, but would not disclose how they knew. They had previously been basing their knowledge of who was at the dinner based on photographic evidence, but who is to say everyone that was in attendance was photographed? Then again, maybe they were not present, and maybe everything Nancy was saying was just a figment of her imagination. Still doesn't explain why that entire part of the investigation was tossed aside. If we're going to make a fuss about story inconsistencies and falsehoods, perhaps we should then also be questioning the changes in both John and Burke's version of events over time. Originally, John said he and Flea Jr. went down, saw the broken window, and were looking for glass. But later, John said he had broken the window earlier that year after locking himself out.
We looked there for glass, again, to see if we could find any glass, because the window was not only open, it was broken. Then I went to the room where we did find JonBenet. The door was latched. I unlatched, pulled it open, and knew instantly what I'd found.
You knew there was a broken window downstairs, right?
Well, I had broken that glass and then opened the window to get in previous summer because I'd left my key and Patsy was gone. I thought we had it fixed, but we never went in the basement, so I didn't know that. So I wasn't surprised that the glass was broken, but I was surprised that the window was open.
Both Ramsey parents had insisted the children were in bed, and no one got up afterwards. And they had no explanation for the pineapple. Yet, Burke admits he had in fact gone back downstairs after he'd been put to bed to play with some new toy.
And I think your dad had said he used the flashlight that night to put you to bed, and then you snuck downstairs to play.
Yeah, I had some toy that I wanted to put together. I remember being downstairs after everyone was kind of in bed and wanting to get this thing out.
Did you use the flashlight so you wouldn't be seen?
I don't remember. I just remember being downstairs. I remember this toy.
I'm sure there's other inconsistencies if we look hard enough, but the point is, we're looking for the common denominator of truth, not reasons to dismiss the various possible truths. Nancy had the support of various victim service advocates who asserted that her testimony was consistent with other ritualized, organized, and systematic abuse survivors, that the prior statements and files held by victim services and her therapist were enough to prove her story had been consistent since long before the highly publicized Ramsey case, and that she had wanted nothing else but to help obtain justice for JonBenet and any other past or present potential victims. She had nothing to gain and everything to lose going against the grain and sharing what she knew in relation to the Ramsey case.
The mystery that has prompted a lot of curious speculation on the part of many legal experts, including my guest. He's written a book. My guest has been referred to as the Sherlock Holmes of forensic medicine. Dr. Cyril Wecht is a doctor, a lawyer, and a master storyteller, and a coroner of Allegheny County, and the author of a book. The title, Cyril, I think the country is begging an answer to this question. Who killed JonBenet? What made you write this book?
Well, I got started in early January of 1997, almost a year and a half ago. I got a call from a reporter at Globe, whom I did not know, asking if I would look at some pictures of a murder case. They brought them the next day, and it turned out to be JonBenet. They wanted my interpretation. These pictures showed the little girl with the rope around her neck and around the right wrist. And since that time, I have received a lot of other information. I've been in contact with many of the news media people in the Denver, Boulder area who have covered this case. I have reviewed the autopsy report and other information that has been leaked in some instances. And I've seen other pictures of the interior of the house. So I wanted to write the book because I felt, number one does not know as we sit here today whether anything will ever happen in a definitive nature, although I have some belief that it will, and I'll mention it later. So the idea, well, why not wait until later? You know, that would mean maybe wait forever. Number two, it's a unique, truly unique murder case.
Well, if you read the book, and I did, I truly have read the book except for the last couple of chapters, and I did not, I just didn't want to give it away to myself. You have a lot of firsthand knowledge that you share with your readers in this book.
Yes, including, by the way, a copy of the autopsy report and a copy of that ransom note, quotation marks,
Is that the most
note,
incredible? Now, you know, as a layperson reading that book, and I'm reading about the ransom note, the intruder obviously did not even prepare a ransom note, came to the house and took the time to write a ransom note on the Ramsey's paper, right?
On the Ramsey's paper and felt point pen. So he just assumed, I guess, as an intelligent, affluent family, that he would find pen and paper there. Right. And he wasn't concerned about being found out. No. He took more than a half an hour writing with his left hand. He wrote this 3-page note, which is really, you know, if it weren't for the tragedy, the death of a little girl, this note would be one of the great laughing things. You can tell a great joke about it. Then, after having written the note, you know what he forgot? He forgot to take the child with him.
If you're kidnapping a child for ransom, why are you taking 20 to 30 minutes to write out a lengthy and detailed ransom letter that makes it clear that you're closely associated to the family enough to know intimate details and have specific awareness of financials? Now, whether they'd stopped to viciously assay her before or after writing the letter doesn't really matter. How and why did it escalate so quickly from a simple kidnapping for ransom to, also, why wouldn't they still take the body with them and still collect the money rather than completely abandoning the original plan? Then the fact that coroners and other expert medical examiners agreed that there was signs she had been assayed prior to her death, regardless of how many times or for how long. Hello?
It's not easy, but we're here with a mission to find the killer of our daughter. So yes, we will sit here as long as you'd like to sit and ask us questions. And tomorrow I may be in my bed crying myself to sleep. But I'm going to do that until we find this person.
And there will be people who watch this and say, as you say that, we want to find the killer. They'll say, well, you are the killer.
You know,
Look, we're never going to convince cynics of the truth, so we don't try to. What we're trying to do is solicit help from the public to find this creature and to beg the Colorado officials to be at least objective and open enough to listen when that tip comes through. Then we'll find this person.
Those pageant videos raised eyebrows, but for some, so did the Ramseys' behavior. Carol McKinley is a veteran Colorado reporter.
John Ramsey got on the phone right after his daughter's body was found to his pilot to get him out of town. I mean, JonBenet's body's lying under the Christmas tree.
It was reported that shortly after you found your daughter's body, that you called the pilot of your plane to arrange a flight to Atlanta. Is that true?
I did. Police took the house over. We had nowhere to go. We wanted to go home.
They didn't want to talk to the police. They lawyered up right away.
The Ramseys agreed to give handwriting, hair, and blood samples. Still, they refused formal interviews with the police.
At this point, they haven't interviewed the mother or father. Not surprisingly, they're still very grief-stricken. They have not been in any kind of condition to be interviewed.
There was no evidence of a break-in. There was no jimmying on the front door. There was no back door crashed in. There were 4 people in that house, and 1 died overnight. So everyone inside was a suspect.
I just want to start off by saying, on behalf of all the agents who investigated child abductions in the FBI, like myself, I want to offer you our sincere condolences.
Thank you.
And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. I've certainly worked thousands of cases where, unfortunately, parents have lost children.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to ask, how can you explain the fact that there's never been another case where the daughter of a businessman has been targeted by kidnappers for ransom, and they left a extremely lengthy and confusing ransom note that was written on materials, with materials in the house.
Mm-hmm.
But then, instead of kidnapping your daughter, they actually, I'm sorry, but brutally murdered her, left the note and the body at the same location, in the same house. It's just never happened before. But what has happened before is tens of thousands of times in that same time period, there have been literally that many cases where somebody staged a crime scene to be something it was not.
You know, that's the police theory, that Burke hit his sister and killed her. And then we, to protect Burke, staged this whole strangulation, ransom note craziness. And that theory would not make good grade C crime fiction on television. It's absurd. The biggest flaw in that theory is that the coroner said the cause of death was strangulation and a severe blow to the head. And Paula can talk to that, I think.
And I talked to this coroner, and this is one of the most unpublicized facts of the case. Those in law enforcement who worked on the case simply ignored it. He said the cause, not causes, cause of death was a blow to the head and strangulation. And when I interviewed him, he said they happened as close to simultaneous as one could imagine. Additionally, she was tortured with sexual abuse.
Okay, so now you got this fracture, and you got a person who's breathing, and so on, and bleeding, right? And the heart is beating, and so on. You know how much blood was found in JonBenet Ramsey's head from that 8.5-inch fracture? 7 cc's, which is a teaspoon and a half. What do you think? If any one of us got cracked on the head like that, do you think there might be more than a teaspoon and a half of blood? She was already dead. That blow was inflicted to make it appear that she had been assaulted by this brutal killer. She was already dead from the rope around the neck that produced cardiac arrest.
You are guilty, Mr. Ramsey, because there was some evidence that your daughter had been sexually molested.
I know as best I can know as a father who was with his daughter every day that I was home. She was not abused or molested before December 26th.
Okay, but on December 26th, there are some indications that your daughter was molested.
Well,
Therefore, here's the motive. You were doing it. Maybe you'd done it before. Maybe you just did it that night. Perhaps your wife discovered you. Whatever it was, JonBenet cried out. You killed her.
Well, fits right in the category of it could have been done by an alien as well. It makes no sense. There's no history. A person doesn't go throughout their lives as a normal human being, one night turn into a monster, slaughter their daughter, go to bed, and get up and act normal from there on. That doesn't happen. In these kinds of cases, virtually all of them, I suspect, where there is child abuse in a family, there's a long history. And that's not the case in our family.
I have to point out that JonBenet's pediatrician, who had been her pediatrician from birth, has publicly said that he never saw any evidence of sexual molestation. There never have been reports from her school, and yet there is the suspicion.
I would have given my life for JonBenet in an instant, and was sorry that I couldn't have done it that night. To be accused of harming my child in any way is beyond comprehension.
This was a very brutal murder, and yet some of the authorities have said that you staged this, that you loosely tied your daughter's hands, that you put the noose, the garrote, to make it look as if some terrible person had done this, that this whole picture was staged.
Well, that's absurd. This was done by a terrible person. The garrote was deeply embedded in JonBenet's throat. Her hands were tightly bound. I couldn't get the knot untied. I tried to get it untied even before I brought her upstairs. The fundamental issue is no logic has been applied to any of this case. Why would I, for example, have staged this horrible scene and then disturbed it myself, pulled the tape off her mouth, carried her upstairs, tried to untie the hands before I brought her upstairs? If I'd have staged it, I would have wanted the police to see it as I staged it. It's not logical. Makes no sense.
Let me give the motive that is ascribed to you, Mrs. Ramsey.
Okay.
Was bedwetting a source of tension in your house?
Absolutely not. All children have accidents.
The motive is that JonBenet wet her bed, and that you got angry, you lost it, you snapped, you killed her, perhaps accidentally. You were downstairs, maybe she came down, she said, "Mommy, I wet my bed." You said, "Again, JonBenet," and you either pushed her or you hit her, you were exhausted, you were furious. You did it.
First of all, we know from the evidence that this was a premeditated murder. The way in which she died, the garrote that was around her neck,
you could have done it. You could have gotten nervous, and afterwards you could have done it. You could have awakened your husband and said, "I did this terrible thing, John, and now we have to stage this." You know people have said this.
Of course they've said it.
But would you have a child, would you get up in the middle of the night and slaughter your child? We're parents, we love our children.
But
no.
What do you say when people say you just snapped? I mean, you know, whatever it was, something went wrong, you did this terrible thing, John then helped you, you staged this whole thing, you know.
It's nonsense.
Maybe you don't even know that she did it.
That's impossible. I mean, it's absurd.
I'm asking the questions you know.
I know.
People have said these are the two major motives. Either you sexually molested her or you snapped because primarily
Let me
she
tell
was
you something.
bedwetting.
I'm a cancer survivor of stage 4 cancer. John has lost a child in an automobile accident. That completely changes your outlook. When you are standing on the brink of death with a terminal illness, your priorities suddenly line up in a row, and you know exactly what the important things are in life. And bedwetting is totally insignificant. I love my children. I wouldn't harm them for anything in the world.
There is a clear connection. And whether there was more than one person involved or not, we know exactly what was going on here based on physical evidence. Same kind of fragments matching the broken paintbrush handle that was used for the makeshift garrote were found inside JonBenet. There was clear and obvious damage to the interior and surrounding area. Numerous experts, specifically on child essay examination, agreed. 33 doctor's visits, with many involving infections that are uncommon in children, unless... really doesn't help narrow down who was responsible on its own, but in a lot of scenarios where essay material is being made, those directly responsible are having children perform under duress and force, with threats to their loved ones or their pets. This is a common thread in many survivor stories, and as Paul Bonacci explained, when he got older in the alleged network he was being trafficked, he was forced to do things to children, and to be the one to do abductions. So even though as a child he was a victim, he would now be implicated as a grown offender in kidnappings and any material they were making within that group, while those actually responsible would manage it as a mafia-style business, earning profits selling the material and humans in whatever capacity.
Bonacci claims that an organized ring of pedophiles abducts children and forces them into a life of child prostitution, and that it happened to him.
They force you to do things, and they photograph it, they film it. The whole purpose for that is to either blackmail you into staying with them or split your mind up so that you don't even remember who you are.
You can check out Paul's story in relation to the Franklin conspiracy and trafficking ring involving Boys Town. Paul, like Nancy in this case, had crucial information about what had happened to Johnny Gosch, who was abducted from Des Moines, Iowa in the early 80s. Johnny was the first child to ever appear on a milk carton. Both of their stories on their own would need its own video.
A Nebraska convict by the name of Paul Bonacci tells the police that he knows firsthand what happened to Johnny.
Paul Bonacci said, I helped with the Johnny Gosch kidnapping. I was the one in the car. I was in the back seat. I was the one that jumped out and grabbed Johnny's legs, while the man who followed Johnny grabbed his shoulders.
They had a couple of pictures of Johnny, and they said that this is the one that they wanted to get.
Bonacci says he's part of a vast network of sexual predators operating across the Midwest. A network that ensnared Bonacci himself when he was a teenager.
Paul Bonacci was a victim who was also used. These children, after they have been molested, they themselves become part and recruit other kids to be put into this. And as long as a boy behaves, he can survive.
I feel so bad about it, because what they made me do.
Bonacci broke down and just cried when he saw me. And he said, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did. But they forced me to.
All I remember was that Mike followed the kid in, and I just put this stuff over his face like I was told to.
I was at the prison. I met with him, visited with him. Law enforcement did not go and visit with him.
When the Bonacci story broke, West Des Moines police didn't believe in it enough to interview him.
We weren't blind. We weren't stupid people. You have to, in some ways, check out certain things as far as you can go with it, because the thing that you might just say, oh, there's nothing to that, might be the answer. You never know.
In 1992, Bonacci is released from prison and tells his story on the TV show America's Most Wanted. As part of the show, Bonacci leads a film crew to an abandoned ranch in Colorado, where he claims Johnny Gosch and countless other boys were once held captive.
This is where they kept some of the kids hidden away underneath the house here. I almost couldn't do it, to even go near the house, because I got up there and the memories flooded back of the last time I was here and leaving here, because this was the last place I ever seen Johnny Gosch at.
Shortly after Bonacci's segment airs, Noreen is contacted by a young man named Jimmy Gibson. He also claims to have been at the ranch with Johnny.
I asked and verified about the birthmark that Johnny had on his chest. And Jimmy described the shape of it perfectly, along with other things that Johnny told him that he had in his room. That information had never been in a news story. Never. And Jimmy knew it.
Jimmy Gibson also tells Noreen about a horrible identifying mark that all the boys held captive at the ranch now bear.
The brand is what they call the rocking X, like a half of a circle, and then there's an X in the center. Jimmy had that brand on his leg. Paul Bonacci carries that brand. Jimmy told us that Johnny also carries that brand.
It's a story almost too sadistic to be true.
In the underground, we started observing and hearing about the rocking X in about 1968-69. We had followed it out to somewhere in Colorado where there was a rocking X operation going on. That was the last I knew of it. And then when Johnny came along and I saw the rocking X again, I immediately knew what the rocking X was.
The point is, we know these trafficking networks exist somewhere, somehow. And it's not always some shady-looking stranger prowling around that can be perpetrating these crimes. It involves your everyday people. But since this is such a high-risk type of product to illegally exchange, it also has the highest price tag. Business earning hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and the main clients are those who have the money to spend. The best kind of clients in any business to have are wealthy clients. Whether you're selling cars, houses, drugs, whichever. So regardless of any of these specific cases, we can factually assert that millions of kids go missing every year without a trace. We know that any large illegal scheme needs to be well organized and is comprised by many people on each level.
I still go back to the same thing I've said from the beginning. A poor pedophile must go out and take the risk of being caught by grabbing their own victim. Does the rich pedophile take that risk of being caught? Heavens no. They pay someone. That's when we develop supply and demand that now has the name of human trafficking, and it's going on everywhere in the United States.
I know that what happened was wrong, and I need to do what I can to try and help stop these guys from doing this to other children.
Which brings us to one last puzzle piece, that whether there was ever any actual direct connections made or not, the timing is truly compelling. It also reveals exactly how many co-conspirators and contributors can be existing within any given organized group involved in child exploitation and trafficking. There were theories based on circumstantial evidence that John Ramsey, his wife, and close associates received immunity by leading investigators to one of the biggest online child SA rings in history. The intel gained during this operation led to many subsequent arrests and operational busts. In the early 90s, federal investigators, from what we'll call the Special Victims Unit, were having to rapidly evolve to begin combating the trade and sale of child SA material online, especially due to the new technology that allowed users to live stream video. The first webcam was conceptualized in 1991, and by 1993, these feeds were able to be connected and broadcasted over the internet. By 1994, this technology was commercially available to the general public. This opened an entirely new avenue of distributing material that allowed predators to not only watch SA material being filmed live, but they were able to make paid requests. Whether these requests were arranged prior, or just to be able to act as a director during the stream, I'm sure there were different options, like an early illegal hybrid of OnlyFans and Patreon. In May of 1993, a 10-year-old boy went missing from his neighborhood in Brentwood, Maryland. This led investigators to a pair of suspicious men neighbors had mentioned that had a certain affinity towards boys. They could not connect to the disappearance of that particular child. They had been operating an online forum being used to meet and speak with minors and exchange media with offenders for over a decade. By September of 1994, a major sting operation called Operation Innocent Images was launched, where detectives and other support staff posed as youths and customers to infiltrate more of these groups. By the summer of 95, they began executing over 100 search warrants nationwide. This led to the discovery of what was called the Orchid Club, that had hosted the live-streamed essay of an 8-year-old girl in 1996. Detectives tracked the feed to the home of Ronald Riva in Greenfield, California, and from there they were able to trace those who had been viewing the stream, including Ian Baldock, who was arrested in October of 1997, who led them to an even bigger organized group called the Wonderland Club. This group had a highly encrypted and secure platform with some of the most advanced technology of its time being used to filter and protect its private members. Through the end of 1997 and early 1998, detectives tried to infiltrate this outfit, but the military level of security of the system was comparative to the encryption technology being used by the KGB. Their requirements for membership were also very specific and protective of the operation, while encouraging the ecosystem to be fed and expanded by each new member. They not only needed to be referred and recommended to the group by an existing member, but to gain entry, they needed to provide 10,000 original images and or video files that didn't already exist on the site. This exclusive access incentivized members who would otherwise only be viewing material to begin creating material of their own. Now, we don't know exactly what kind of cybersecurity or other software and technology Access Graphics was providing in the favor of national security for Lockheed Martin, but if any early tech company predating the dot-com bubble could have the hardware capability and access to the military levels of cybersecurity capable of hosting and managing this type of operation, it'd be a company like Access Graphics, with strong military connections and technology, being a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin, who is one of the largest military defense companies leading in security and technology. Oddly enough, Lockheed Martin sold off Access Graphics and its shares in November of 1997, in spite of having earned record-breaking profits in 1996. This was following the announcement that John Ramsey would be stepping down from the company. The CEO of Lockheed Martin, Norman Augustine, had already stepped down in April of 1997. Now, all of this is important to keep in mind, because it was late 1997 that Operation Cathedral was launched, targeting this Wonderland Club, which was discovered to have nearly 1 million images and videos, with contributors from all over the world. On September 2nd, 1998, a global raid was launched, and 104 suspects were arrested at the same time, from 13 different countries, including Australia, Belgium, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, the UK, and the US. Access Graphics had a location in Amsterdam and had business connections with Belgium. We know what Amsterdam is known for, what is legal there, and that there's a much lower age of consent. Is it possible that investigators had ceased their pursuit of the SA angle of the Ramsey case because John Ramsey was able to give law enforcement access to this exclusive Wonderland Club in exchange for immunity? Could this be why Lockheed Martin wanted to detach and distance himself from Access Graphics? Or was it just that there was no longer any business to be done together? Or had John Ramsey's company been part of the task force trying to infiltrate these groups early 1996, and upon discovering that he was an enemy within, JonBenet was targeted out of retaliation? One way or another, we know there were missing pieces to this case, and that a lot of people went to great lengths and spent a lot of money to obstruct and complicate the investigation. We know that Linda Arndt, a special victims unit type of investigator, was called into the scene well before JonBenet was discovered, or that it was determined she had been SA'd. Linda had immediately become suspicious of John as they were both examining JonBenet up close, and he rattled her senses with his calm and cordial demeanor. She called for backup at least twice after being left alone waiting for the ransom call, and was greatly outnumbered between the Ramseys, 4 of their friends, and their local pastor. She was admittedly in fear for her life after JonBenet was discovered, and even made note of the ammo on her person. What exactly had she witnessed that morning in those crucial moments that she was prevented from speaking about publicly? Could it have had anything to do with the details and evidence that was sealed for national security reasons? Linda later resigned from her position and even filed a lawsuit against the Boulder Police Department for infringing on her rights to free speech. So what does that tell us? Could they have been on to John and his associates during the Orchid Club bust? Or could it be that Ian Baldock gave up key members of this larger Wonderland Club group in order to have a lesser sentence, and John Ramsey was on that list? We know that even the government, with their inhumane experimentation, they did also include the SA and other complex trauma on minors to unlock new partitions in the brain that are otherwise unused by the average human, for high-tech reprogramming and other training purposes. There is a lot of factual information supported by government and legal documents, so we have to start taking it all into consideration as the bigger picture becomes clearer. Is it possible that JonBenet was part of one of these military programs, and that all of this coincided in a lucrative business venture? Is it possible that's what Fleet White Jr. and John Ramsey had a fight about? Not that he was not cooperating well enough with investigators, but was way too cooperative, and this was a threat to the revenue streams for their intergenerational organized network Nancy had alleged Fleet White Jr. and Sr. were involved in, and she claimed to be a victim of? I do believe Nancy was providing key information, that it was a miscarriage of justice to have tossed out the baby with the bathwater, just because it was supposedly found that one of the details she provided was wrong. One detail proven false, that was provided by an alleged perpetrator, and so all the other details were considered null and void? I also believe that she could be easily manipulated by those who contributed to her prolonged complex abuse, and that her own memories are likely fragmented. Dissociative disorders are very common in complex trauma victims. It would also be very easy to suggest certain information to confuse and mislead that victim, who is already in a divided and compartmentalized mind as a result of said trauma. Trauma victims are very easily made out to be crazy, since many struggle with addiction and other forms of self-medication and escapism, which can further scramble and alter their already patchy memories. Our minds are incredible in the way that they can block out and nearly delete severe and or prolonged trauma. It's truly incredible, but there are always fragments that remain, that can lay dormant until decades later. All of these psychological reactions intended to protect the victim also works against them. Where of course if you see your whole family mauled and eaten by lions, and you must go on to escape and survive, just blocking it out and detaching from the horrific memory is the answer. But in a civilized society, where the trauma can be more layered and complex, prolonged, and being perpetrated by those who are meant to love and protect, it's almost like the worse the trauma, the harder it is for that victim to ever have their justice. Even when they do remember and can start putting the pieces together, it's long past the statute of limitations, and or there is zero evidence left in existence to support the claims. Just because there's not enough evidence to convict doesn't mean a crime wasn't committed. Maybe John Mark Carr did know JonBenet, and did legitimately feel close to her, and even had a hand in her demise, but not physically. They did make sure to mention his online persona after he came forward claiming his guilt, and he was charged with similar crimes after his computers were seized in 2001. He kept saying he can't share exactly how he had a relationship with her, and that it may implicate other people who were technically innocent. So what does that mean? Maybe Gary Oliva was present as well, but again, not a physical participant. Maybe everything they were both saying was online roleplay actions. We gotta think outside the box here, and read between the lines.
I've contacted the Ramsey family, especially before Patricia passed away, and I conveyed to her many things, among them that I am so very sorry for what happened to JonBenet, and it's very important for me that everyone knows that I love her very much, and that her death was unintentional and it was an accident. And I made several efforts to communicate with Patricia before she passed away, and it's my understanding that she did read my letters and she was aware of me before she passed away.
What happens in the basement?
It would take several hours to describe that.
If you could be brief.
There's no way that I could be brief about. There's no way I can be brief about it. It's a very involved series of events that require a lot of time, and I can't. I wouldn't want to say something briefly about it because it would not. First of all, it's very painful for me to talk about. The only thing that I can say is it's not what it seems to be. It's
in what way?
Every way. It's not at all what it seems to be.
Was there anyone else with you in the basement?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
Consider the other possibilities outside of the perpetual echo chamber of the same information regurgitated over and over again. Was the photographer Randall Simon the videographer? Which is why his telltale heart sang when he was arrested during his little breakdown in 1998? Seems like the pieces might be actually falling together here.
You know that stupid Pinky doll? It's a thing, by the way. Pinky doll is a trend. You know when they do, oh, the roses, oh, the roses, oh, the hat, oh, the roses, that on TikTok is gaining money. Do you understand that? So when people put in the live, like, can you jump up and down? And then I'll give you more roses. They do that. If I send you a bigger gift, will you do this? There are virtual buyers that sit on a computer and say, hey, can you slap them? Can you punch them? Can you turn them upside down? Can you open their legs for me? Can you snuff them? And I'll pay you more money. There's that too. There's virtual buyers.
I do believe there was something far more sinister going on than what appeared on the surface. and it's very likely there was more than one person involved. These men were obsessed with her in the way that some may become obsessed and feeling close to an OnlyFans model, like that girl who made over $40 million this past year. Her top supporters probably do feel like they have some kind of close relationship with her, especially if they're a longtime follower. I guess this really only leaves more questions than answers, but I think it's definitely worth thinking about and discussing. Feel free to share your theory in the comments, and let me know if I missed any factoids that may add more clarity. I would rather believe law enforcement was doing its job, and that giving one man or a small group freedom from punishment of a certain crime in order to take down many for that same crime is a common strategy used to take down someone higher up than whoever they've caught at the time. They'd rather get to the kingpin than waste their time on a street-level dealer. But does this do any justice for JonBenet? What was the deal with the bowl of pineapple anyways? It was found in JonBenet's stomach, but it was Patsy and Burke's prints on the bowl and spoon. John mentioned having taken an Ambien the night before to get to sleep quick due to their morning flight. Patsy was still in her clothes from the night before, although some would argue that meant she stayed up all night writing the ransom note and staging the crime. Could have also meant that she was dosed and fell asleep suddenly. Was the pineapple in the bowl ever tested? I'm going to add a lot more links to the description of this one, with more info and resources regarding everything we covered in this video. There are a lot of different rabbit hole entrances to explore, and I not only encourage, but urge you to do more of your own research and come to your own conclusions. Knowledge is power, no matter how you cut it.